The wind whispered through the ruins of an old Polish village, carrying the ghosts of screams that once tore through the air. A quiet manor stood at the edge of the woods, its windows shattered, its walls hiding a truth too dark to imagine. No signposts, no fences, no watchtowers, just a simple building that became the birthplace of industrialized murder. Before Auschwitz, before Treblinka, before the world even understood the word Holocaust, there was Chelmno. Here, the Nazi regime tested how to kill not hundreds but thousands, every single day, efficiently, silently, without leaving a trace. Inside this place, people stepped off trucks believing they were being sent to work, only to be led into a small van that hissed with gas instead of air. It was here that death was no longer personal. It was engineered. Men in uniform smoked cigarettes and shared jokes while engines roared, muffling the cries of the dying. This was where evil stopped being chaos and became organized, calculated, methodical. And as the world slept, Chelmno became the prototype for every extermination camp that followed. What began here would change the very nature of human cruelty forever. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Killing Ground. Snow fell softly over the Polish countryside, blanketing the village of Chelmno, nad Narem, in a deceptive calm. From a distance, it looked like any other winter morning in occupied Poland. Smoke curling from the chimneys, frost clinging to the windows, the slow creak of wooden carts rolling over frozen earth. But behind that stillness, plans were already unfolding that would make this quiet village the birthplace of systematic mass murder. The world had never seen anything like what was about to begin here. No battle lines, no explosions, just silence and death perfected by design. In late 1941, as the German Reich expanded deep into occupied Europe, the machinery of genocide was still in its experimental stage. The Nazis had already conducted the so-called euthanasia program, a euphemism for murdering their own disabled citizens with carbon monoxide gas. Those methods were effective, but too visible, too bureaucratic, too noisy. What they needed now was a system that could erase entire populations quietly, efficiently, without the moral hesitation of individual bullets. The solution was to build a place where killing could happen like factory work, mechanical, repetitive, and hidden. That place would be Chelmno. Chelmno nad Narem was chosen for one simple reason. It was small, secluded, and forgotten. A village surrounded by thick forests, lying near the river, cut off from major roads. The Nazis saw opportunity in its obscurity. It already had an old manor house, the Schloss, standing at the edge of the forest. Once home to Polish nobility, it was now empty, cold, and perfect for conversion. Its basements and cellars could hold prisoners. Its courtyard could disguise trucks. The forest nearby could bury secrets. To the SS, this was not just a village. It was a blank page on which they could design the future of extermination. The man selected to lead this new experiment was SS Hauptsturmführer Herbert Lang. A quiet, precise man in his 30s, Lang had already proven his loyalty and efficiency in the T for Euthanasia program. He was no stranger to gas chambers or deception. When he arrived in Chelmno, the villagers watched him with unease. His men commandeered the manor house, sealed its doors, and brought in German engineers to modify it. Trucks came and went under tarpaulins. Windows were blacked out. Within days, the place transformed from a noble estate into a prototype killing center. The operation's design was simple in theory, but horrifying in execution. Victims would arrive by truck, told they were being resettled for work in the East. They would be led into the manor's basement under the pretense of disinfection, stripped of their belongings, and ushered into the back of a special vehicle. The doors would close. The engine would start. Instead of taking them anywhere, the exhaust pipes were rerouted inside, pumping lethal carbon monoxide. By the time the truck reached the forest burial site 2 miles away, everyone inside would be dead. The corpses would then be dumped into pits dug by local laborers and covered with earth. Within a few hours, the truck would return for more. It was murder on wheels. For the Nazis, Chelmno was not just another camp. It was a laboratory. Every movement, every command, every deception was measured, recorded, refined. SS engineers tested how many people could fit inside a van before panic slowed the process. They experimented with engine speeds, sealing methods, even the slope of the floor, so that bodies would slide out more easily. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were the birth of an industrial process. Each adjustment, each detail, was meant to make killing smoother, faster, more detached. Outside the manor, life in the village continued with a strange and fearful normalcy. Farmers still worked their fields. Children still played in the snow. But whispers spread quickly. Locals saw the covered trucks rumbling through at dawn and returning empty. They saw German soldiers burning piles of clothing behind the manor. They smelled something in the air, a thick, oily stench that clung to the cold wind. They pretended not to know, because knowing was dangerous. Yet, deep down, everyone in Chelmno sensed that something unspeakable was happening among the trees. By December 1941, the first transports of Jews arrived from the nearby town of Kolo. They came in wagons and trucks, clutching bags of clothes, hoping for work or food. SS guards greeted them with polite smiles, assuring them of relocation. They were led into the manor courtyard, where warmth and calm words gave way to barking orders and the snapping of whips. Within minutes, men were separated from women, mothers from children. The air filled with confusion. Not screams yet, just confusion. People still believed they might survive the day. That illusion lasted only until the engines began to roar. Herbert Lang watched his creation from behind a window, expressionless. He wrote in his reports that the system worked flawlessly. Within the first few days, thousands were killed. The forest became a graveyard. Local Poles forced to dig burial pits spoke later of bodies stacked like wood, of soldiers laughing as they tossed corpses into the earth. The ground was frozen, so they used fire to thaw it. Flames reflected off the helmets of SS guards as smoke drifted into the night sky. And yet, the outside world knew nothing. There were no records, no witnesses who could speak freely. Only rumors, traveling along the wind like ghosts. The Germans called Chelmno Kulmhof, its Germanized name, to erase its Polish identity. Signs were erected forbidding entry, and guards patrolled the nearby roads. Supplies arrived daily: gasoline, lime, ammunition, food, and alcohol for the soldiers. Chelmno was self-contained, isolated, efficient. To the higher SS command, it was a success story. Reports reached Berlin that the resettlement of the Jews was proceeding effectively in the War-the-Land region. No mention of murder, no mention of gas vans, only special treatment. The language of bureaucracy became a weapon, hiding genocide behind office paper. At night, inside the manor, the SS men drank. They joked, played cards, and wrote letters home. Some claimed later they were following orders, others that they felt nothing. But the younger soldiers, unaccustomed to the smell of death, vomited behind the building after the first few runs. Their superiors told them to toughen up. It's just part of the job. Gradually they did. Within weeks, they became numb. They stopped hearing the pounding from inside the vans. They stopped noticing the faces of the victims. Chelmno turned them into something less than human, and that was exactly the point. The site's transformation went beyond physical construction. It represented a psychological shift in the Nazi system. Until then, mass murder had been chaotic: shootings in forests, mobile killing squads, scattered massacres. Chelmno turned chaos into order. It was a prototype for the future extermination camps like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. What happened here was a blueprint for the final solution itself, an administrative way to make death invisible. By January 1942, the killing had become routine. Each morning, the trucks lined up in the courtyard, engines idling. SS men prepared lists, checked fuel, smoked cigarettes. The victims arrived in groups of 200 or 300. Within hours, the forest pits filled again. Birds vanished from the area. Even the trees seemed to die faster that winter, coated with soot from constant burning. Some nights, villagers heard the engines from miles away and the faint cries that followed. Short, muffled, and final. Among the first to sense the scale of what was happening was the local Polish underground. Couriers passing through Kolo reported seeing trains unloading hundreds of Jews who never returned. One survivor, a man forced to bury corpses, escaped in early 1942 and carried his story to Warsaw. His name was Slama Br. Weiner, later known by his alias, Jakub Grojanowski. His report would become one of the first eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust, describing Chelmno in horrifying detail. But for now, in those first months, his warning went largely unheard. Inside the SS hierarchy, Chelmno's results caught attention. Himmler's office requested detailed reports on the efficiency of the gas vans. Engineers from Berlin visited to observe. They took notes, measured exhaust volumes, and refined the technology for broader use. In a sense, Chelmno became a testing ground not only for death, but for language, for how to disguise it. From this point forward, the Nazis would never again call it murder. It would always be processing, cleansing, resettlement. Words as cold as the steel of the vans themselves. By spring, the manor's walls were blackened with soot. The stench from the forest grew unbearable, even for the soldiers. Flies covered every surface. To solve this hygiene problem, the SS ordered the pits reopened and the bodies burned. Villagers saw the fires through the trees, orange light flickering in the darkness, and smelled the sickly sweetness of burning flesh. Still, no one dared speak. Silence was safer. Each day, as the trucks rolled out toward the forest, the sound of their engines blended with the wind, and the world outside continued to believe that life was normal. That was the true horror of Chelmno, not just the killing, but the invisibility of it. Death became ordinary. It became quiet, and in that quiet, the foundation of the Holocaust was built. By the time spring thawed the ground in 1942, tens of thousands were already dead. The manor's windows were boarded, its rooms empty except for the echo of boots and whispers. The Nazis had proven that industrialized murder could be done without camps, without crematoria, without witnesses. They had found a formula, and they were ready to replicate it on a scale beyond imagination. The forest of Rzeszów stood heavy with secrets. Beneath its soil lay the first victims of a system that would soon spread across Europe. Herbert Lang stood at the edge of one of the pits one evening, hands behind his back, watching smoke curl upward. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was the acknowledgement of success. Within weeks, his methods would be shared, refined, and expanded. The machinery of death was ready to move east, to Belzec, to Sobibor, to Treblinka, and eventually to Auschwitz. And so, in this quiet Polish village, far from the battlefields of war, the future of extermination was born. Chelmno had become more than a camp. It was an idea, a system, a machine that reduced human life to logistics. The snow would melt, the fields would bloom, and the world would still not know. But those who survived nearby would never forget the sound of engines in the cold air, the smell of smoke drifting through the pines, and the feeling that something monstrous had awakened in the heart of humanity. As the chapter closes, the camera lingers on the frozen forest, silent and still, the faint hum of distant engines echoing like ghosts. The viewer senses that this is only the beginning, that what was tested here in Chelmno would soon engulf an entire continent in death. The killing ground had been born, and its shadow was only beginning to spread. Chapter 2. The Blueprint of Genocide. The trucks rumbled through the frozen mud outside Chelmno before dawn, their headlights cutting across the fog like pale knives. The air was sharp with diesel and frost, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Inside the manor house, the men of the SS were already awake, preparing for another day's work. There was no shouting, no rush, only the sound of boots on floorboards and the low hum of engines being tested. Murder had become a routine, and the blueprint for how to make it faster, quieter, and invisible was being perfected here. By early 1942, Chelmno was no longer an experiment. It was a functioning system, a working model of how to exterminate entire populations. Its efficiency impressed the Reich Main Security Office, which sought to duplicate its methods across occupied Poland. But before that expansion could happen, every detail of Chelmno's operation needed to be studied, refined, and formalized, from how victims were gathered to how their bodies were disposed of. The camp became, in every sense, the classroom of genocide. At the top of this evolving machinery sat Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS empire, who believed that Germany's victory depended not only on military conquest, but on racial purification. To Himmler, extermination was not chaos, it was policy. His subordinates, Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, turned that policy into procedure. Paperwork flowed between Berlin and occupied Poland like veins pumping blood into a monstrous body. Chelmno's daily reports became data. Its death tolls became success metrics. The bureaucrats were building a science of death. But it all began with the victims, the people the Nazis labeled as units. Jews from the Lodz ghetto, Roma families, Polish intellectuals, and Soviet prisoners of war. The orders were clear. Eliminate them with maximum efficiency, minimum attention, and zero cost. For the SS, killing had to be logistical, not emotional. It had to feel like an administrative task. The same way trains move coal, now they would move human beings. Each transport schedule, each manifest, each coded message between officials served as a building block for this new, horrifying design. Herbert Lang understood this better than anyone. He kept detailed notes on the performance of the gas vans, on how long it took to kill, on how many bodies could fit per trip. His men reported the smallest issues: engines stalling, victims fainting too early, soldiers becoming ill from the smell. Every problem had to be solved, every inefficiency removed. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was optimization. The camp was a laboratory where death was measured in seconds and liters of exhaust. The gas vans themselves were grotesque marvels of mechanical ingenuity. Outwardly, they looked like ordinary delivery trucks, marked with company logos to deceive onlookers. Inside, the floor was sealed with metal plating. A pipe connected the exhaust to the interior compartment, diverting carbon monoxide into the space where the victim stood. The door slammed shut, bolts secured, and within minutes the sound inside shifted from panic to silence. The driver would listen for the moment it grew quiet, a signal that the load was complete. Then he would drive to the forest, tilt the back, and the bodies would spill out like cargo. The Nazis called this Sonderbehandlung, special treatment. The words turned murder into routine. Soldiers used it without hesitation, their voices detached and procedural. They were no longer killing people. They were conducting operations. Chelmno's command structure rewarded efficiency. Those who met quotas were praised. Those who hesitated were replaced. The system didn't rely on sadists. It relied on workers. And that was what made it terrifying. It didn't need hatred, only obedience. Behind the manor, the forest of Rzutchow grew darker each day. The snow was streaked with ash, the ground sunken from the weight of bodies buried beneath. Workers, mostly Jewish prisoners forced to assist, shoveled earth over the graves, their hands trembling in the cold. They were promised survival for their labor, but they knew what awaited them. When their work was done, they would be sent into the vans themselves. In their eyes, the forest was alive with ghosts, the trees whispering the names of the dead. Inside the manor house, SS officers gathered around tables covered with blueprints and maps. They weren't discussing ideology or hate speeches. They were discussing logistics, how to increase capacity, how to streamline arrivals, how to dispose of clothing and valuables without leaving evidence. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scratching of pens on paper. To them, this wasn't murder, it was progress. Each improvement would later be exported to the Operation Reinhard camps that followed, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. At night, after the killing was done, Lang's men drank. They played gramophone records in the dining hall, their laughter echoing through the corridors where victims had stood hours earlier. Some boasted of their work, exaggerating numbers like hunters comparing trophies. Others sat silently, staring into their glasses, haunted by what they had seen but unable to speak. Their humanity was dissolving, replaced by numbness. It was easier to drown guilt in alcohol than to admit it existed. Meanwhile, in the ghettos of Poland, rumors spread. People whispered about a place, called Chelmno, where transports vanished and never returned. Survivors from nearby villages told stories of trucks that hissed and screamed before going silent. But most refused to believe it. The human mind resisted the idea of extermination on such a scale. How could an entire village be wiped out without gunfire, without explosions? It seemed impossible, and that disbelief gave the Nazis exactly what they needed: time. Berlin took notice of Chelmno's success. Reports arrived on the desk of Reinhard, who was then organizing the infamous WW2 conference. The data from Chelmno, the number of victims processed, the speed, the secrecy, became the foundation for the final solution. At WW2, when officials discussed evacuation to the east, they weren't talking theory. They were describing a plan already tested and proven in Chelmno. The camp was the blueprint for genocide, disguised as resettlement. Heydrich's ambition was to replicate Chelmno's system on an industrial scale. He saw in it the potential to exterminate millions without disrupting the war economy. Factories could keep running, trains could keep moving, soldiers could keep fighting, while entire populations disappeared quietly in the background. This was the cold genius of the Nazi system. Genocide not as chaos, but as administration. The camp at Chelmno had shown it could be done. Now, the Reich was ready to expand it. In early 1942, SS engineers arrived to inspect the site. They adjusted ventilation systems, improved the efficiency of the vans, and even calculated how to use fewer men per operation. They brought with them new paperwork procedures to track valuables: gold teeth, jewelry, watches, coins, everything stripped from the dead before disposal. These items were shipped to the Reich's treasury, labeled as recovered property. Even the ashes from the pits were sifted for gold. Nothing was wasted. Herbert Lang sent updates regularly, his tone dry and bureaucratic. He described how long it took for a truck to kill its passengers, how many trips could be completed per day, how the disposal sites were camouflaged with branches. His language was clinical, almost scientific. He didn't use words like people or bodies. Instead, he wrote about loads and capacity. The reports read like technical manuals. They were, in effect, the first operating instructions for genocide. But not everything went according to plan. The engine sometimes malfunctioned. In winter, the freezing temperatures made it harder to dig graves. The drivers complained about the stench inside the trucks and the leaking exhaust pipes. The victims, packed tightly together, sometimes clawed the walls so violently that blood pooled at the doors. When the vans were opened, the interiors were covered in gore. Mechanics were ordered to reinforce the walls with steel plating to make cleaning easier. The process was constantly evolving, improving. The blueprint wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Chelmno taught the Nazis how to control perception. Every stage of the killing process was built around deception. The victims were greeted politely, told to undress for a medical examination, and promised warm soup after disinfection. Guards spoke softly, smiled even, to keep order. The moment of realization came only when the doors of the truck slammed shut and the air grew thick with fumes. By then, it was too late. The system relied on hope, a weapon far more powerful than fear. Outside the manor, the forest became a graveyard without markers. As weeks turned into months, the ground began to sink under the weight of thousands. The smell spread for miles. Villagers walking along the river noticed the water turning dark with ash. They whispered prayers when the wind blew from the north. Some said they could still hear cries at night. Yet, no one dared investigate. The SS had made it clear. Anyone caught near the camp would disappear too. In the summer of 1942, the command structure of Chelmno changed. Herbert Lang was reassigned, and his successor, Hans Bothmann, arrived with new orders: expand the operation and increase efficiency. Bothmann was younger, colder, and even more methodical. Under his watch, the camp's killing procedures became clockwork. Transports arrived at dawn, victims were dead by noon, and the forest burned by dusk. Both men even introduced new vans that could carry more passengers at once. He was praised for innovative leadership. The camp's efficiency came at a terrible human cost. The Jewish laborers forced to assist, the Sonderkommando, were kept alive only as long as they were useful. They loaded bodies, cleaned vans, and dug graves, knowing that every breath might be their last. When their strength faded or they learned too much, they were executed and replaced. Yet, despite the terror, some of them found small ways to resist. They hid letters in the soil, carved names into trees, whispered prayers into the smoke. Their acts were invisible but defiant, the only proof that humanity still existed amid the machinery of death. Chelmno's model soon inspired the construction of permanent extermination camps. At Belzec, engineers built stationary gas chambers modeled after Chelmno's vans. At Sobibor and Treblinka, they created railway platforms to disguise the arrival process. Every detail, the deception, the timing, the disposal, came from what had been learned in that Polish manor house. Chelmno was the prototype, the first draft of the final solution written in blood and exhaust. Even as the system expanded, Chelmno continued to operate, feeding the Nazi machine with statistics. Tens of thousands from the Lodz ghetto were sent there through 1942 and 1943. Each name erased, each life reduced to a number on a report. The men running the camp didn't think about faces or voices. They thought about logistics, schedules, supplies, maintenance. The blueprint was working, and that success would doom millions. When winter returned, the killing slowed. The soil froze again, and the fires burned longer to hide the evidence. Bothman's men began dismantling parts of the operation, burying ash under layers of snow. They believed their work was nearly done, but the SS High Command saw otherwise. The lessons from Chelmno had proven too valuable to discard. The camp would become a reference point for every extermination center that followed. It was no longer just a place, it was a model. As the year ended, a silence settled over the forest. The pits were full, the vans idle, and the manor stood empty for a brief moment. Yet the blueprints were already spreading across occupied Europe, carried by orders, diagrams, and instructions. The men who had learned to kill efficiently at Chelmno would go on to build new camps with gas chambers made of concrete instead of steel vans, with chimneys instead of open pits. The experiment had succeeded. The machine of genocide had found its form. Somewhere in the woods, under layers of ash and frost, lay the evidence of what had been designed here. The blueprint of genocide was not written in ink. It was etched into the soil, into the bones of the dead, into the smoke that rose each morning over Chelmno. And though the killing would move on to larger camps, the system born here would remain its foundation. As the chapter closes, the wind rustles through the bare trees of Rzutchow Forest, carrying the faint echo of engines and distant voices. The manor stands dark and silent, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. The world beyond remains unaware that in this forgotten village, humanity has crossed a threshold it will never return from. The blueprint is complete, and the machinery it inspired is about to consume all of Europe. Chapter 3. Commandant Herbert Lang and his men. The first thing people noticed about Herbert Lang was the way he moved. Precise, economical, like a man who had learned to remove every unnecessary gesture from his life. He arrived in Chelmno with a clipboard, a surgeon's calm, and a history that made him uniquely suited to the work the Reich had planned. Before Chelmno, he had been an operative in the so-called euthanasia program, where the state had practiced killing its own disabled citizens behind closed doors. That experience taught him two things that would shape Chelmno: how to cloak murder in bureaucratic language, and how to organize death so it looked, on paper, like a task completed. He brought both lessons with him to the manor at the forest's edge. Lang dressed the part of an efficient officer, a dark uniform buttoned to the neck, polished boots, a razor-sharp haircut. But the uniform was a mask for a colder efficiency underneath. He measured the courtyard in footsteps. He timed the vans in seconds. He kept lists. He wrote notes in the early morning light while the rest of his men slept. In those entries, the victims were never people. They were loads, batches, processing units. This small, clinical vocabulary mattered. It allowed him, and the men under him, to treat murder as administration rather than as an act that demanded conscience. Around Lang gathered a cadre of men chosen not for monstrous enthusiasm, but for their willingness to obey and to be methodical. There were the drivers, who learned the particular rhythm of the gas vans. There were the mechanics, who sealed the interiors and rerouted exhaust pipes with an engineer's care. There were the clerks, who stamped forms and inventoried clothing and jewelry stripped from the living, as if cataloging shipments of material. Then there were the guards, men who stood at gates, whispered orders, and learned to speak with the same neutral tone as the paperwork. They laughed sometimes. They joked about food. They drank. They also learned how to stop hearing the faint sounds that might have tugged at their humanity. Not every man at Chelmno was an SS regular. The workforce was a patchwork: full-time SS, reservists pulled from police units, local men coerced into service, and a rotating group of prisoners forced into the most gruesome tasks. The regime preferred that cruelty be distributed, so the responsibility felt diluted. This diffusion of duty made the whole enterprise more resilient. If one man balked, another stepped in. If one driver grew pale at the sight of a crying child, a supervisor would quietly replace him and move him to a less visible post. The machine required parts that fit. Those who did not fit were removed. Among the prisoners pressed into service, the Sonderkommando, the cruelty was different and closer. These were men and women taken from transports and told they would be spared if they worked. They cleaned the vans. They dragged bodies from the trucks and stacked them like cordwood. They sorted through clothing and jewelry for items to be sent back to the Reich. They built, they buried, they burned. Every day, they handled the dead as if feeding a fire. They learned, with a clarity that no one else could claim, how the system worked. They also learned its cruelty. They were kept alive only because their labor was useful. The knowledge of that conditional life hung over them like a blade. Lang's orders about the Sonderkommando were merciless but cunning. He insisted they be kept isolated in the manor cellars, fed barely enough to work, and monitored constantly. At the same time, he allowed small privileges that bound them to their handlers. An extra piece of bread here, a momentary reprieve from work there. These small mercies were tools, a means to ensure cooperation. It was a deliberate calculus. Keep useful prisoners alive long enough to serve, and then eliminate them when their utility ended. It was the cold arithmetic of the camp, writ in human flesh. The men under Lang were not all uniform in temperament. Some displayed a mechanical indifference born of orders and training. Others showed signs of deeper moral corrosion, not just numbness, but pride in their efficiency. A few could be cruel for cruelty's sake, finding in the work a perverse freedom, and a smaller number fought back with quieter, private shocks, a moment of nausea behind the stables, an attempt to look away during an unloading, a letter burned in secret. But the command culture Lang fostered punished deviation. Hesitation meant suspicion. Suspicion meant reassignment, and reassignment often meant the front lines or worse. The fear of being singled out kept many obedient. The relationship between commander and men was not forged in speeches, but in routines. Lang would stand at the manor window and watch the courtyard like a man viewing a factory floor. He timed the arrival of trucks to the minute. He expected the vans to be loaded and dispatched in a single, smooth choreography: arrival, disrobing, loading, sealing, transport to the grave, return. Deviations from that choreography were recorded and corrected. He demanded reports that read like technical manuals, precise numbers, times noted down in crisp handwriting, mechanical problems logged and solved. The men learned to take pride in meeting his standards. Efficiency became an ersatz virtue. Discipline at Chelmno operated through small rituals as much as through formal punishment. Each morning began with roll call, not of prisoners, but of equipment. Trucks checked, tools inventoried, fuel counted. Men polished guns and boots, folded uniforms with care, and then went about the work of the day. At lunch, they ate meat and drank and listened to gramophone music. The contrasts were jarring. The comfortable ritual of a meal set against the knowledge that the afternoon would bring another convoy. These rituals normalized the mundane, and in normalizing the mundane, they dulled the edge of horror. The manor staff included a number of functionaries whose work was purely administrative, but whose hands shaped outcomes. There were accountants who tallied valuables taken from victims and arranged their shipment to the Reich. There were clerks who falsified transit records, creating a paper trail that obscured the reality on the ground. And there were the junior officers who walked the perimeter, ensuring secrecy, who favored soft-spoken threats over loud brutality, the kind of menace that left no visible scars but ensured compliance. Lang relied on each of them. He wielded administration like a blade. Outside of the manor walls, the camp network relied on other institutions to feed it: the railway schedules, the ghetto registrars, German officials who supplied lists of those to be resettled. Lang's office coordinated quietly with local police and ghetto administrators. Orders were couched in euphemism, special transport, processing, phrases that reduced a human fate to a bureaucratic task. This bureaucratic camouflage served two functions. It prevented immediate moral scrutiny, and it allowed the camp to operate like any other public utility: predictable, manageable, and hidden behind forms. Lang's presence altered the local meaning of power. Where once the manor symbolized aristocratic legacy and seasonal rhythms of harvest, it now bore the odor of soap and camphor and the metallic tang of gasoline. Villagers learned to measure time by the sound of engines and the movement of lorries. They learned to read the manor's shutters like a code. Open windows meant activity inside. Closed windows meant a day of transport. Word traveled in fragments. A neighbor saw a column of smoke in the woods. Another saw a pile of discarded clothing. A third overheard the laughter of men at night. Fear became the village's constant companion. Within the SS hierarchy, Lang reported his successes in a tone that made the work seem clinical and unremarkable. His dispatches emphasized throughput, maintenance issues, and methods for making the vans more airtight. In those communications, he proposed improvements and asked for tools, but he never wrote about faces. He never recorded the names of those he had sent to their deaths. That omission was intentional, and it served to shield not only Lang, but the network of men who relied on him. Paper could be kept tidy, consciences could be blurred, yet beneath the smooth machinery, tensions sometimes surfaced. Drivers argued over routes. A mechanic complained when a van seized up mid-transport. A guard was caught drinking on duty and fined. These incidents, small and prosaic, revealed how the camp operated at the human level, not as a single monstrous mind, but as a collection of ordinary people, each making choices, small and large, that together produced a catastrophe. The scale of the horror depended on the sum of these everyday choices: the choice to obey, the choice to look away, the choice to follow an order without questioning its moral content. Resistance within the camp's walls was rare, but not non-existent. A few Sonderkommando attempted subtle acts of defiance, hiding a small item of jewelry to pass to someone outside, carving a name on a piece of wood and burying it, whispering a prayer so softly that it became a secret. These acts were hardly strategic, but they were human. They were tiny breaches in the system's attempt to reduce everything to procedure. When the men who committed them were discovered, the punishment was swift and final. Yet those small resistances lived on in the memories of the few survivors and in the testimony they gave after the war. The psychological adjustments Lang demanded worked both ways. His men hardened themselves with language and ritual. They justified each action as duty. They laughed and drank and cataloged. But the work also altered Lang. Men who stared too long into the vans sometimes found their dreams invaded by images they could not erase. Some tried to keep diaries and then burned them. Others wrote clinical reports and placed them into files that would later be used as evidence. Even the most efficient men felt the ache of what they had done in private, in rare moments when the gramophone stopped and the manor fell silent. As the camp matured, command responsibilities shifted subtly. Lang delegated more, tested subordinate officers in ways that groomed them for further service, and watched how they handled pressure. He promoted the obedient, the punctual, the men who could look at bodies and still order maintenance for the vans. In this way, he was not merely running a killing site. He was training a cadre of functionaries who would carry the techniques of Chelmno elsewhere. His influence would ripple beyond the manor's walls. The men who served Lang were ordinary in many respects and extraordinary in their capacity to obey the machinery of death. They were sons and brothers, sometimes polite with locals, sometimes crude and cruel. Their humanity and their dehumanization existed side by side. That contradiction is crucial to understand. They were not mythical monsters, but people who chose to make efficiency their moral compass. In the end, that choice mattered more than any uniform. One winter evening, near the edge of the forest where the earth still bore the faint hollows of graves, Lang stood and watched a convoy roll away. He adjusted the collar of his coat against the cold. Behind him, some of his men laughed at a private joke. Others were silent. He had engineered a system and watched it function. He had applied the lessons of T4 and honed them into a method that could kill thousands with dreadful regularity. He had trained men to follow his charts, his timings, his moral erasure. The success of that training was terrifying. As the chapter closes, the viewer senses that the personal story of Herbert Lang and his men is not a sidebar, but the engine of a broader tragedy. Their rituals, their choices, their paperwork. These were the gears that turned genocide into policy. And although the manor's windows reflected only darkness tonight, the methods learned within them were already being carried outward, ready to be applied on a scale none of them had yet fully imagined. The next stage, the expansion, the bureaucratic codification, the wider network of killing sites, was waiting at the edge of the map. The men who had learned here would be asked to teach. The lessons would travel. Chapter 4. The Arrival of the Victims. The morning air over Chelmno carried a brittle cold that bit the cheeks of those who waited on the muddy roads. But it was the sound that pierced the quiet. The low, persistent clatter of wheels on ruts, the hollow clunk of a crate being shifted, the cough and belch of diesel engines warming in the frost. From the edge of the village, a convoy emerged. Covered trucks, their tarpaulins buttoned down, soldiers on the flanks with rifles slung and faces already trained to neutrality. At the back of one truck, a woman pressed her forehead to the rough wooden slat and listened, as if the sound of the road could tell her what lay ahead. She could not know. No one could. The moment she stepped down, her life would narrow to a single, cruel string of orders. Before the transports began, the Nazis perfected a vocabulary of deceit. Notices were posted, typed letters delivered, and local administrators read the same lines with gentle authority. Resettlement to the east, labor transfer, medical screening. In the Lodz ghetto and beyond, those phrases sounded official and final, but they also contained a whisper of hope, a hope the regime used as a tool. People hurried to comply because disobedience promised immediate violence. They gathered what they could carry: bundles of clothing, tin cups, tiny toys tied in cloth. Men folded shirts with trembling hands. Mothers tied scarves around their children's necks, smoothing hair that would never be seen again. The hope in their faces was the last currency the Nazis allowed them to spend. The logistics of deportation were, from the German perspective, a triumph of planning. Train timetables were amended. Local police were briefed. Lists of names were compiled and verified. Routinely, ghetto officials were forced to compile manifests, ticking off names as if checking inventory. Those lists became the first link in the chain, a paper trail that made the transports seem administrative rather than murderous. At the loading sites, clerks shouted numbers that matched the manifests. People were herded forward in lines measured not by emotion, but by centimeters. The bureaucratic rhythm, The stamping of passes, the click of ink on paper, masked the rupture beneath. The sights at the collection points were unbearably ordinary. Crates of bread, stacks of tin cans, the gray, geometric uniformity of winter coats on hung shoulders. Yet there were ruptures in that ordinariness. A man clutched a small bundle of photographs, their edges curling with the damp. A child, no older than 6, clutched a rag doll whose face was worn smooth by a lifetime of consolation. Old women sat on low stools and hummed prayers under their breath, voices swallowed by the wind. The air tasted metallic from the diesel, and the fear, a sourness that stuck behind the teeth. For many, the mundane acts of folding and checking offered the illusion of control. For others, every movement felt like a step toward a cliff. The SS and police orchestrated arrival like a military exercise. Guards in sturdy boots walked the perimeter. They barked curt instructions. They pointed without words. They separated families with a glance. Men were ordered to one side, women to the other. Children clung to mothers, asking questions with eyes too old for their faces. The guards used to practice softness, a smile here, a reassuring word there, to keep panic at bay. That small kindness was, cruelly, part of the method. If people believed comfort, they would go where they were told. If they resisted, the answer was swift and visible. The rifle but against the shoulder, the sharp slap that silenced a protest. Most complied. Fear, after all, can look like consent. At Chelmno, the arrival process had been honed to a sequence like a factory line. Trucks would pull into the manor yard under the supervision of clerks and guards. People would be marched through a narrow corridor of shouted commands and barked orders. They would be told to leave their coats, to surrender money and jewelry, to climb a set of stairs heading to the basement. In the winter, the stair railings were cold under the palms. In summer, the stones sweated against skin. There was always the same small, deceptive ritual, a flicker of kindness, a bowl of steaming water promised, a claim that delousing and a short rest would follow. In that moment, when a child accepted a spoonful of soup, all ordinary life still seemed possible. The deception extended to sights that would have comforted the wary. Actors in plain clothes, men trained to speak softly, sometimes played the role of officials inspecting transports, asking routine questions, as if in a census. Where are you from? Do you have family? The sound of those questions made the scene feel formal, even proper. The trick was in the ordinary details: a nurse's white apron, a clipboard, a rubber stamp. Those props gave the operation a veneer of medical legitimacy. People signed forms with hands that trembled. They traded their names for a mark in a book, and in doing so, they unwittingly recorded their own disappearance. Inside the manor, the environment was cooler, the light reduced to a thin slant through small, high windows. The basement smelled of damp stone and soap, though the soap was only a pretense. Men, women, and children were ordered to disrobe. They were asked to place clothing in neat piles that disappeared in the hands of clerks who had learned to move without looking at faces. The tactile memory of that moment is sharp in survivor testimonies. The rough cloth of a coat, as it was removed, the weight of boots left behind, the chill of naked skin against the cellar's cold air. People tried to talk to each other. Strangers clutched hands. A man might fold his wife's scarf, thinking some domestic action could resist the incomprehensible. The soundscape changed as doors closed behind the victims. The manor's corridors, which moments before had been a bustle of voices and the clink of metal, fell to an anxious hush, and then to a new, mechanical sound. The soft thumps of heavy boots, the scrape of van doors being opened and closed, the measured ticking of time. Guards coordinated with drivers by gestures and short commands. A driver would heave the rear door and signal with a nod. Inside the vehicle, people pushed and shuffled, their breaths fogging in the cold. The smell of the confined space was immediate and choking. Hot bodies, cloth, fear, a scent that lodged in lungs and memory. The voyage to the killing sites was a small, cruel journey. The trucks moved slowly along rutted paths into the trees. From the outside, They looked like ordinary transports. From the inside, they were a coffin in motion. The engines coughed and idled. The driver's boots pressed the pedals as if steering toward a depot rather than a mass grave. The sound of the road had, for a brief span, a deceptive normality. Birds in the hedgerows, the scrape of branches, the far-off bleat of a sheep. Those ordinary noises contrasted with the tightening atmosphere inside the vans, where whispers turned to prayers and then to a stunned silence as the engine's exhaust, redirected into the compartment, began its deadly work. The death inside the vans was clinical and abetted by the mechanical. There was no single image that captured every case, no single sound that described all the endings. But survivors would later speak of a moment when the air seemed to thicken, when voices grew raw, when those who had been shouting settled into an exhausted stillness. It was not always immediate. In some cases the air grew thin and dizziness took hold. In others, the pace was unnervingly swift. When the trucks reached the forest clearing, those working outside, often prisoners themselves, pried open the rear, and the bodies tumbled out in a heap, the living indistinguishable from the dying at first glance. The tactile horror of that moment is almost impossible to describe. The slickness of clothing in winter, the weights and the limpness, the hush that followed the finality. The burial process was methodical and unceremonious. Pits had been dug deep in the soil of Rzuczo Forest, and into them the bodies were stacked, covered with earth, and, when smoke and fire were used later, burned in place. The men who dug and filled those pits were often prisoners who had been spared temporarily because their labor was needed. They worked with hands numb from cold and from what they had seen, their spades ringing on the bone-hard ground. The sound of shovels was a grim counterpoint to the earlier bureaucratic clicking of forms. It spoke of the physical labor of erasure. Sometimes the pits were so full that the earth sank, forming depressions that would never fully recover. For the villagers and forced laborers who observed from the margins, the arrival of transports became a calendar by which they measured fear. They learned the timetables in their bones. Trucks at dawn, silence by midday, smoke in the evening. They learned to lower their curtains when a convoy passed, to avoid the manor's roads, and to pretend ignorance when soldiers asked questions. Some tried to help in secret, slipping bread into a child's sleeve, passing a scarf through a fence, small acts of human defiance that risked everything. Those gestures of defiance mattered. They were signals that not everyone was complicit, even in the shadow of terror. The arrival process had ripple effects far beyond Chelmno. The Lodz ghetto, once a place of cramped survival and communal resistance, felt the hollowing impact of each transport. Families left behind scoured for news, listening for any sign that someone might return. The sound of a single name being read off a manifest could make a room of people hold their breath. The psychological damage was immense. Hope truncated, community eroded, life reorganized around the fear of the next knock at the door. The transports were not only the removal of bodies from a place, they were the removal of the social fabric that had allowed people to face occupation together. Administrative complicity made the process efficient. Local officials, coerced or complicit, handled lists and coordinated departures. The Reich's infrastructures, railways, timetables, telegraph lines, became tools of annihilation. Even mundane tasks like scheduling and toolbox repair contributed to genocide. A mechanic tightening a bolt, a clerk filing a manifest, a driver checking oil, all small acts that combined allowed the system to function. The ordinariness of these actions is what made the machinery so effective, and what allowed ordinary people to become cogs in an extraordinary crime. The emotional tenor of arrival days varied across the victims. Some marched with a resigned stillness that was almost ritual. Others fought, pulled at the hands of guards, clung to the rags of a loved one. Women sang quietly sometimes to soothe children, voices thin and bright against the cold. A father might teach his child a tiny arithmetic game to pass the minutes, the numbers a brittle lifeline inside an impossible reality. The human need to make meaning, to reclaim some agency in the smallest routines, persisted even under the most brutal conditions. Those tiny resistances, a whispered prayer, a folded note hidden in a seam, were small, but they kept memory alive. As the transports continued, the scale of disappearance became visible in the accounts that slipped out when people escaped or when neighbors dared to speak. Messengers carried stories about men taken in the night, about families that vanished without a trace, about the smoke that would rise into the winter sky and carry with it the smell of something that could not be named. Those reports traveled to larger centers of resistance and to international observers, yet often they were dismissed as exaggerations or impossible to verify. The regime had designed the arrival process to be invisible to scrutiny, to operate in the spaces between official records and personal grief. By late 1941 and into 1942, the arrival of victims at Chelmno became not a series of isolated tragedies, but a systematic, repeating operation. The village's roads became arteries carrying human cargo in a regular rhythm. Departures, arrivals, the clack of forms, the hum of engines. For those inside, every transport blurred into the next. For those outside, each transport was a fresh wound. And for the system itself, the process had achieved its grim objective. People were rendered manageable, counted, cataloged, and then eliminated, with the same bureaucratic precision that had once run post offices or rail depots. In the hollow after a day of arrivals, when the last truck had gone and the manor's shutters closed, the world seemed to contract. The voices in the village dimmed. The river flowed without comment. But the memory of those who had arrived remained, in the dropped scarf, in the small lump of earth disturbed by a shovel, in the quiet grief of those left behind. The transports had removed bodies, yes, but they had also emptied rooms of stories, of recipes, of jokes and lullabies. Whole collections of family gestures and idiosyncrasies were lost in the span of an afternoon. The cultural erasure was as real as the physical. And yet, even in the shadow of that erasure, small acts of courage persisted. A courier might memorize a name and whisper in Warsaw. A man might hide a scrap of paper with a line of verse. In the chaos at the loading station, someone might pass a note in a shoe, a fragment of a name to be later found and recited at a memorial. Those tiny resistances, fragile, human, stubborn, were the thin threads that kept memory from vanishing completely. As the chapter closes, the camera lingers on a single transport as it disappears into the forest road, dust rising in its wake like a pale veil. The viewer feels the absence left behind, a chair at a table, an empty bed, a quiet doorway. The arrival ended in ways most could not imagine, but it also marked a stage in a larger process that was unfolding across Europe. The next act, the methods of disposal, the attempt to erase even traces of the dead, waits in the darkened trees beyond the road. The trucks roll on, and the machine, having learned how to bring people to its doors, will now teach itself how to make them disappear without a trace. Chapter 5. The Manor House of Death. The manor door closed like a verdict. One moment the yard was full of voices, bargaining, crying, the scrape of boots, and the next the rooms beyond those heavy oak panels were hushed, reduced to the precise, clinical sounds of work. Inside the Schloss, the air smelled faintly of soap and wood polish, a domestic scent meant to soothe and to deceive. Lamps threw soft pools of light on staircases that had once led to family portraits and evening parlors. Now they illuminated corridors where nameless people shuffled in, undressed, and were prepared for a fate that no polite word could hide. The manor had become a theater set, familiar props, benign lighting, a stage calm that hid the machinery of death. The approach was engineered for compliance. Men and women were guided through the courtyard and into a narrow entrance where clerks stood with paper, ink, and an air of officious calm. The clerks moved with the rhythm of office workers. Pens clicked, stamps fell, names were written in columns that would never be used to bring anyone home. Each signature felt like a small surrender, a legalistic transaction that made disappearance tidy. People handed over their belongings without the ritual of a trial. They believed, or allowed themselves to believe, in the comforting formalities of process. That belief was part of the design. It smoothed the day, making the unimaginable seem administratively plausible. Downstairs, the cellars were colder than the rest of the house. Stone walls drank sound, so conversations became muffled and intimate in the way of confessions. Here, prisoners were told to remove their clothes, as if stepping into a bathhouse. The command was framed as hygienic. Men in plain coats handed out coarse towels and spoke in calm tones about disinfection. The tactile details were searing in survivor recollections. The sudden chill of sudden nakedness, the grit of stone underfoot, the metallic clang of a metal bucket set down. Hands that had counted money or patched roofs found themselves fumbling with the unfamiliar shutness of being stripped down to skin and fear. The ritual of undressing served multiple functions. Practically, it stripped victims of valuables, which were inventoried and cataloged in stacks of boxes to be sent north. Psychologically, removing clothing was an act of power. To be made bare before strangers was to have dignity taken in a small, intimate way. Clerks moved like accountants, fingers learning the texture of a gold ring, the catch of a brooch, the tear in a shoe. They had trained eyes for watches, for hidden coins sewn into hems. The pile of garments that accumulated in the corridor smelled of smoke and the faint perfumes of lives interrupted. Those fabrics would be sorted, laundered if possible, and inventoried as property recovered from the resettled. There was theater to the deception. A so-called disinfection room was arranged with wash tiles and a perfunctory basin. A nurse's apron, a white towel, a bowl of steaming water, props that rendered the scene medically believable. Staff in civilian clothing pretended to examine throats, to check the pulse with an attentive expression. Men with clipboards scribbled, temperature normal, no contagion noted. The whole charade satisfied the need for a narrative. This was not the footnote of annihilation, but the continuation of ordinary public health practice. The victims, tired and frightened, often found solace in the ritual of examination. A woman might smile at a nurse's gentle fingers. A grandfather might nod when a hand smoothed his shoulder. Those small reassurances dissolved within an hour. From the manor's inner rooms came the sounds of preparation, the rustle of clothing in piles, the creak of wooden trunks being opened and shut, the soft murmur of men assigning numbers, the measured clank of metal keys. The language of efficiency saturated the air. One more van in 10 minutes, check bolts, fuel is scheduled. Specialists moved like stagehands. Mechanics in grease-stained shirts reworked doors and reinforced hinges. Drivers examined tires, tightened bolts, and tested latches until the vans felt like sealed caskets ready for the road. Every technical detail had a human aim. Make the process as quick, smooth, and unremarkable as possible. The prisoners who served within the manor, ordered to fold clothes, to polish shoes, to push carts, lived in a closeness to death that altered them in subtle ways. They developed a new vocabulary of avoidance. Eyes met and then slid away. Conversations were reduced to necessary exchanges, thin threads intended to preserve the smallest flickers of sanity. They learned how to move so the guards would not take notice, how to cough casually to hide a sob, how to pretend that exhaustion was normal and not the tremor of dread. Yet in the privacy of the stone cellars, under the hum of dim lamps, some kept a fragile record, a name scribbled on the underside of a box, a folded scrap with a child's drawing slipped between pages. These small secret acts preserved trace identities in a place designed to erase them. The manor staff developed their own routines as well. There was the clerk who ironed forms with an almost domestic tenderness, laying each paper flat, as if creating an order of service. There was the driver who kept his gloves impeccably clean, as if polish on leather could mask the stain on his hands. There was the woman in charge of the linen who hummed while she stacked towels, a lullaby that seemed to belong to an earlier life. These rituals were survival mechanisms, for the staff, a way to maintain order in a place built on disarray. For some, routine became a shield against the emotional truth of what they were doing. The manor's rooms held contradictions. A piano in the parlor that had once been used for concerts now gathered dust. A children's painting on the wall offered a ghost of domesticity in a house of horrors. Sometimes musicians among the guards would play a gramophone record to dull the silence. The melancholy crackle of classical music, a jarring overlay on the day's work. The sound of violin, a waltz, just out of phase with the scene, created an uncanny dissonance. Beauty pressed against brutality. It was a sound the prisoners remembered for years. The way notes swelled in the high-ceilinged rooms, even as doors thudded and boots stomped and the vans awaited in the yard. Inventory and bookkeeping were central to the manor's work. Boxes labeled in neat script, clothing, jewelry, silverware, were prepared for transport. Men were ordered to separate coins into neat groups. Tooth fillings, gold caps, and other small treasures were pried for mouths by technicians who had learned to work efficiently and without question. The way the items were handled was clinical. A gold ring was wrapped in paper. A watch was wound to check its mechanism. A brooch was pinned to linen as if cataloging a museum piece. Later, in Berlin, those items would be assimilated into the Reich's coffers. The manor had become, to use the language of the perpetrators, a net that gathered and exported value. The processing of people also required a medical veneer. In some rooms, men in lab coats pretended to examine prisoners, looking for signs of infectious disease, checking teeth, poking throats, all with performative seriousness. Medical instruments were shown with the same air of authority that made white coats credible. A stethoscope's soft thud could tranquilize the mind for a moment. The pretense of care made the betrayal more painful. To be touched by a hand in a white sleeve was to be reminded of what civilization had promised and then cruelly denied. Within the manor's basement, there existed a grim choreography for moving people to the vans. Men were instructed to walk in single file, to keep pace, to board the vehicle calmly. The guards used small commands and the occasional physical shove, maintaining a rhythm that turned shock into motion. Drivers barked out short signals to synchronize steps. Motions were rehearsed until they became automatic. The efficiency was achieved through repetition. Repetition produced a dulling numbness. That numbness is what allowed the process to continue without collapse. Some prisoners attempted to resist in the only ways available. A man might hide a ring in the seam of a shirt. A woman might tuck a photograph into a sleeve that she hoped would not be searched. Others found symbolic methods of defiance. Whispering a prayer in an old dialect, pressing a morsel of bread into a child's palm, mouthing a name until the syllables burned into memory. These acts were small and perilous, yet they were profoundly human. They testified to a refusal to be reduced to an inventory entry. They were the fragile embers of dignity. The manor also produced accidents and failures that revealed the fragility of the system. Once, a van door jammed, and men inside screamed until someone pried it open. On another occasion, a clerk misfiled a box, and an SS officer spent hours angrily seeking it out. These disruptions were terrifying in their unpredictability because they hinted at the human element beneath the procedures. A squealing hinge or a miscounted coin could alter an entire day's sequence, and the reactions to those interruptions were often cruel and immediate. A beating, a shouted reprimand, a transfer for spontaneous insubordination. The threat of such punishment kept labor moving, kept eyes averted, kept the work of erasure unbroken. The sensory realities of the manor were relentless. The stone walls absorbed voices. Cold seeped into bones. The clink of metal against metal became a soundtrack. Air thickened with the scent of sweat and oil and the sharper tang of disinfectant, a smell that suggested cleaning but masked cruelty. Light was pallid, filtered through curtained windows. Shadows gathered in corners where people huddled for warmth and for a momentary private thought. And yet, there were human details that persisted. The way a child's hair smelled after a spoonful of soup, The rough tenderness of a father smoothing a sleeping child's brow. The quiet persistence of a woman humming a song from her homeland. These were small resistances that the records did not capture. As night fell, when the manor's shutters were drawn and the vans had roared away, the building took on another kind of silence. The staff would tally the day's throughput. The clerks would pack documents into crates. The mechanics would oil the gears for the next morning's runs. Some of the prisoners who had been allowed the temporary reprieve from labor sat in corners, talking in whispers, telling one another names, promising small acts of remembrance. The manor's rooms held these private conversations like fragile relics, but the walls themselves seemed to close in, as if swallowing those whispers into their mortar. What transformed the manor from an ominous place into an instrument of horror was not just the physical arrangement of rooms or the technical competence of its staff. It was the way daily habit and administrative language rendered atrocity invisible. When cruelty is administered as procedure, when it is translated into timetables and ledgers, the human cost blurs behind terms and totals. The manor's true power lay in that erasure, in the conversion of living lives into data, in the quiet way history could be extinguished between a signature and a stamp. Yet even in that deliberate machinery, cracks appeared. A clerk who had handled so many forms sometimes paused and folded a scrap of paper into his pocket, an impulse he could not name. A driver, on his way to tighten a bolt, would stand for a moment longer by the doorway and listen to the muffled noise of the yard, hearing in it the echo of cries that would not leave him. These small hesitations were private, and they were rarely acted upon, but they showed that the system, for all its order, relied on human beings who could, in other moments, be moved. The manor, in its quiet efficiency, taught a terrible lesson, that architecture and ritual could be weaponized. A room meant for receiving guests could be repurposed to receive the condemned. A basin for comfort could be arranged for betrayal. The manor was the proof that ordinary places could be converted into extraordinary cruelty if outfitted with the right language, the right tools, and the will to reduce people to procedure. As dawn approached again over the courtyard, with frost edging the stones and the first drivers arriving to begin the cycle anew, the manor stood as a mute witness, polished, prepared, and ready. The doors would open, and another procession would begin. The next phase of the operation loomed, the metal lungs of the vans waiting in the yard, the forest beyond with its pits and smoke, the repetition of movement that made killing seem like a routine. The manor had done its work in perfect silence. What followed beyond its walls would test that silence in ways both mechanical and moral, and the machines were primed to roar. Chapter 6. The gas vans, a mobile hell. The engines began to growl before the sky, even lightened. From the manor yard at Chelmno, a gray mist clung to the ground, and through it, the silhouettes of two large trucks emerged like beasts waking from hibernation. They looked harmless enough, dull, heavy, marked with false company logos painted neatly on their sides, Kaiser's Coffee, or Deutsche Reichspost. The camouflage was deliberate, a detail crafted in Berlin. To anyone passing by, they were simply delivery vehicles, carrying supplies along country roads. But inside, behind their riveted panels and reinforced floors, lay the Reich's most terrible invention, a weapon that turned transportation into extermination. The men who operated the vans knew their task with the precision of craftsmen. Each morning, they checked the seals around the doors, tested the clamps that would be bolted shut from outside, and examined the hoses that snaked from the engine's exhaust to the interior chamber. The air smelled of oil and gasoline, a scent that mixed with frost and silence. Mechanics wiped their hands on rags blackened by soot, unaware that their technical diligence was perfecting the process of murder. Herbert Lang's orders were clear: no mistakes, no delays, no unnecessary suffering. Death must be efficient, quiet, invisible. When the first group of prisoners arrived from the manor basement, they still clutched at fragments of hope. Guards shouted for them to line up, calling out in languages they barely understood. A soldier with a polite smile told them the trucks would take them to work sites nearby. The victims hesitated, not because they suspected the truth, but because something about the scene felt strange. The windows of the trucks were small and covered with steel mesh. There were no benches inside, only metal floors slick with condensation. But fear had long since been replaced by exhaustion. They climbed in one by one, carrying the belief that compliance might spare them. The door slammed shut with a hollow thud that echoed across the courtyard. A bolt slid into place. The sound of metal locking against metal was final, a punctuation mark on a sentence that had begun months earlier in the ghettos of Poland. A driver shouted at the guard by the manor gate, and the engine coughed, spat smoke, and roared to life. Inside, the air vibrated with the noise. The victims swayed as the truck lurched forward, its wheels sinking into the frozen mud. The journey lasted barely 10 minutes, but it was long enough for the engine's exhaust, rich in carbon monoxide, to fill the compartment. The first breath stung, the second burned, and by the third, it was as if the air itself had vanished. Panic spread faster than understanding. Hands clawed at the walls, nails scraping the metal. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding them from nothing. Voices shouted prayers that collided and dissolved into chaos. Then the sound grew muffled, swallowed by the thick, choking fog inside. Outside, the driver smoked a cigarette and kept his eyes on the forest road ahead. He knew the signs, the slowing of movement, the dull thumps that faded, the stillness that meant his task was complete. When the trucks reached the Rzuczo forest, the clearing was already prepared. Jewish laborers, the Sonderkommando, waited under guard, shovels in hand. They had dug the pits themselves, long trenches that stretched like open wounds across the frozen soil. The air carried the faint sweetness of decay, mixed with exhaust. As the truck reversed toward the edge, its back doors opened. For a moment, the steam that poured out looked like fog. Then the bodies began to slide, heavy and limp, onto the earth. The men at the pit moved quickly, grabbing limbs, dragging corpses into position, stacking them in layers. No words were exchanged. Silence was the only form of protection left to them. For the SS overseers, the process was an innovation. Chelmno's gas vans represented a turning point, the first step in transforming killing into a transportable industry. Stationary gas chambers would later follow, but here, in this village, mobility was the key. The vans could move between sites, reaching new victims each day without the need for permanent infrastructure. They could kill as they traveled, turning every road into a potential execution site. This flexibility thrilled the bureaucrats in Berlin. They had found a way to make genocide portable. Engineers at the Reich Main Security Office refined the design constantly. They experimented with different engines, gasoline and diesel, to find which produced the deadliest concentration of carbon monoxide. They measured times, testing how long it took to kill 50 people versus 70, how altitude, temperature, or passenger density altered the process. These were not military studies. They were scientific reports in the service of murder. Notes recorded the efficiency of gassing per kilometer and oxygen depletion rates. The language stripped away morality, leaving only data. To the operators, however, the vans were both a tool and a burden. The interior was hard to clean. When the doors were opened, the smell of death rushed out. Sour, chemical, unforgettable. The metal walls dripped with condensation mixed with blood. Soldiers gagged, covering their mouths with cloths. Some requested to be transferred, unable to endure the sight. Lang refused. He told them that service in Chelmno was a test of loyalty. "If you cannot handle this," he said once, "you cannot serve the Reich." Those who stayed learned to perform their duties with brutal detachment. They scrubbed the vans after every run, hosed them with water, sprinkled lime powder, smoked cigarettes to drown the stench, and prepared for the next group. The victims came in waves. Jews from the Lodz ghetto, Roma families, prisoners of war, anyone deemed unworthy of life. The trucks made multiple trips each day, their engines never cooling. On some mornings, frost collected on the metal grates, and the guards used torches to melt it away. On others, Rain turned the yard into sludge, and the wheels spun deep into the mud as the drivers cursed under their breath. The monotony of death became routine, predictable, almost banal. Men joked about their morning deliveries, about how many passengers the vans could carry. Humor became their armor. Occasionally, something went wrong. Once, a hose cracked and leaked exhaust into the cab, poisoning the driver. He was found slumped over the wheel, his face blue, his last breath identical to those he had killed. Another time, the truck's door jammed, and the guards had to force it open with crowbars. The scene that spilled out was so horrific that even the soldiers looked away. Afterward, they reinforced the hinges and installed a stronger locking mechanism. Every flaw, every failure, became an opportunity for improvement. This was how the system learned, through horror repurposed as innovation. The Sonderkommando, those who handled the aftermath, bore the worst of it. Forced to unload corpses, strip them of valuables, and bury them, they lived for days at a time in a fog of nausea and terror. Their hands cracked from cold and contact with flesh. They were not permitted to look the SS in the eye. Many whispered prayers as they worked, their voices barely audible above the rumble of idling engines. They knew their fate. Every few weeks, they too would be executed and replaced. One survivor later wrote, "We were dead already, only the body had not been buried." In the forest, the burial grounds expanded. The pits were widened, the earth soaked with fluids that stained it black. In spring, when the thaw came, the smell spread for miles. Villagers complained of the stench, but German officials dismissed it as fertilizer from the manor. Flies swarmed the clearing, covering everything in a moving film. Dogs scavenged at night, their howls echoing through the woods. Still, the killing continued. The forest became a silent accomplice, its trees swaying gently over a grave that grew larger with every dawn. For the Nazis, the gas vans were not an aberration, but a prototype. Reports from Chelmno reached Berlin by coded telegram, celebrating the efficiency of operations. Himmler himself requested data from Lang. The numbers were impressive. Thousands killed within weeks, minimal ammunition used, almost no public disturbance. The vans were hailed as a success. Soon, similar vehicles were deployed to other regions, Belarus, Ukraine, Serbia, spreading Chelmno's technology across occupied Europe. Wherever the trucks appeared, death followed. But success came at a psychological cost to those who ran the operation. Guards began drinking heavily, unable to sleep. Some claimed they heard knocking in their dreams, fists against metal, screams trapped behind doors. They tried to drown the sounds with music, with laughter, with cruelty. One driver kept a radio in his cab, playing cheerful tunes as he drove to the forest, humming along to mask what he was doing. Yet when he looked in the mirror, he sometimes caught his own reflection and flinched. He saw not a soldier, but a caretaker of hell. The local population lived in a state of tense awareness. Farmers heard the engines day after day, saw the black smoke over the trees, and smelled the strange, heavy air. They whispered among themselves, describing the trucks as death wagons. Some risked everything to tell outsiders what they'd seen. One Polish villager, a railway worker, managed to warn the resistance in Lodz, saying, "They come full, they go empty, and the air smells like burned oil and something worse." His words would later appear in underground reports that reached London, but at the time, few believed them. The idea of mechanized murder was simply beyond imagination. Inside the camp, the routine consumed all sense of time. Day blended into night, each operation identical to the last. Guards timed the drives, 12 minutes, 14 if the road was muddy. The efficiency improved, and with it, the death toll rose. The engines never stopped long enough to cool. Mechanics kept spare parts ready, replacing gaskets and pipes as if servicing delivery trucks. Every new modification shortened the time between departure and silence. Killing had achieved its rhythm. And yet, even as the system perfected itself, cracks began to form. Some prisoners managed to hide during loading, slipping into cellars and crawling through narrow ducts. A few escaped into the woods, carrying fragments of the truth. Their words, gas, trucks, forest, were written down by the underground press. The first eyewitness accounts of Chelmno's gas vans emerged from those whispers. They described the vehicles, the sounds, the false kindness of the guards. Their testimonies would later become among the earliest evidence of what the Nazis called special treatment. By late 1942, the gas vans had killed tens of thousands. The manor itself began to show signs of decay. Windows broken, floors stained. The drivers, hollow-eyed, moved like sleepwalkers. Some had been replaced. Others simply disappeared, reassigned to new projects that carried the same purpose under new names. The technology born here would soon find permanence in brick and concrete at places like Belzec and Sobibor. The mobile hell of Chelmno had proven that industrialized killing was not only possible, but sustainable. When the final trucks of the day returned to the manor, their engines sputtering with fatigue, the silence that followed was immense. The men washed their hands, ate their meals, and wrote letters home as if their work had been ordinary. The sound of cutlery on plates, the clink of glasses, filled the rooms where, hours earlier, death had been dispatched. Outside, the forest exhaled smoke that rose into the night sky, a thin gray ribbon twisting toward the stars. The gas vans were parked neatly in a line, their metal sides reflecting the last traces of moonlight. They looked, for a moment, like sleeping animals. But they were not at rest. They were waiting. The next morning, the cycle would begin again. More victims, more orders, more silence. Each rotation refined the method. Each day, the system grew smoother, colder, more confident. And as the engines cooled under the stars, the men who built them, drove them, and cleaned them could not know that the machines they tended would become the blueprint for the death factories that followed. The static gas chambers of Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka. Chelmno's mobile hell had taught the Reich its most valuable lesson. That killing could be mechanized, detached, and multiplied. The world outside slept, unaware that the future of genocide had already taken shape in the quiet roads of a Polish forest. The trucks waited, their tanks full, their engines ready. And when dawn came again, the mist would rise, the bolts would slide, and the hum of the first engine would signal that the machinery of death was once again in motion. Chapter 7. Into the forest of Rzutchow. At dawn, a cold mist rolled through the trees of the Rzutchow forest, weaving between trunks like a living thing. The world was quiet except for the distant hum of engines. Birds had long abandoned this place. The soil itself seemed to breathe, heavy with what it held. To the untrained eye, the forest looked peaceful, untouched. But beneath its roots lay a grave that stretched endlessly beneath the surface, a grave large enough to swallow a village. The wind carried the faintest trace of ash, the lingering scent of burned hair and exhaust, and the silence was thick with ghosts. The trucks arrived in a slow procession, their wheels cutting deep ruts into the frozen path. Guards stood at the clearing's edge, smoking cigarettes, their breath visible in the morning chill. Behind them, Jewish prisoners from the Sonderkommando waited with shovels, their faces pale and hollow, their hands trembling. They knew what the trucks carried. They had seen it before, every day, every hour, in an endless repetition that had stripped them of any illusion of hope. The forest had become their prison and their tomb, and every tree bore witness to the weight of their labor. When the first truck stopped, the driver climbed down and walked to the back. He didn't look inside. He didn't have to. He unlatched the metal clamps with the numb precision of a man who no longer felt anything. A rush of foul air spilled into the clearing, a mixture of exhaust, sweat, and decay. The smell was unmistakable, a dense, oily stench that clung to clothing and hair and refused to leave. The Sonderkommando stepped forward without a word. They reached into the truck, their gloved hands pulling, dragging, lifting. The bodies were heavy, limp, and still warm. They slid onto the ground with dull thuds, forming grotesque piles that steamed in the morning air. The guard called out orders, short, sharp, mechanical. The work had to be done quickly. The dead were sorted by size, stacked in layers inside the trenches dug days before. One layer of bodies, then a layer of earth, then more bodies. The rhythm of burial was steady and relentless. There was no ceremony, no pause. Only the sound of shovels biting the earth, the creak of branches above, the dull roar of another truck approaching. The forest floor was never still. As more trucks came, the soil was churned, disturbed, reshaped. Some graves were so deep that the men inside had to climb down ladders, their feet sinking into the soft mud. They worked in silence, except for the occasional muffled cough or the clink of a spade against a rock. The SS guards watched from the edge, smoking and laughing quietly among themselves, as if overseeing construction work rather than a burial ground for thousands. Every so often, an officer would walk along the line, hands behind his back, inspecting the progress like a supervisor. If he saw a man pause, he'd raise his pistol, a silent reminder that even hesitation could mean joining the dead. As days turned into weeks, the pits filled faster than they could be covered. Bodies decomposed quickly in the damp soil, releasing gases that caused the ground to swell. The forest began to stink of death. The air grew thick and sour, and insects gathered in swarms so dense they looked like smoke. The guards sprinkled lime over the graves to control the odor, but it only added a bitter edge to the air. In the summer, when the heat rose, the smell spread for miles. Villagers nearby could no longer ignore it. They whispered to one another that the forest was cursed, that demons lived beneath its trees. The prisoners who buried the dead were themselves part of the machinery. They were chosen for their strength, but strength never lasted long. Hunger, exhaustion, and despair wore them down. Their eyes became hollow, their movements slow. They learned not to look at the faces of the corpses they handled, not to search for someone they might know. But sometimes recognition struck anyway. A son found his mother's shawl. A husband glimpsed his wife's ring. In those moments, time seemed to stop. The world shrank to the space between one heartbeat and the next. Then the guard shouts broke the stillness, and the men had to keep working. The dead could not wait, and neither could the living who were only living by mistake. The forest consumed everything. It took the sound of laughter and turned it into echoes. It took the color of the sky and dimmed it beneath its canopy. The victims disappeared into its soil, and with them, their names, their histories, their songs. The only witnesses left were the trees, and even they seemed to bend away from the clearing, as if trying to unsee what happened below. When rain came, it turned the ground into black sludge, mixing blood and mud until they were indistinguishable. The men worked knee-deep in it, their boots filling with water, their skin raw and blistered. Each night, when they were led back to the manor cellars, they could still feel the weight of the corpses in their arms, the smell trapped in their lungs. Sleep brought no relief, only dreams of sinking into the same earth they had filled. By spring, the graves could no longer contain the numbers. The SS realized the forest was becoming a problem. The swelling ground made the terrain uneven, and the smell grew impossible to hide. Orders came from above. The bodies must be burned. Cremation would erase the evidence and free space for more. It was a task beyond human endurance, yet it fell to the same prisoners who had dug the graves. They were ordered to exhume what they had buried, to unearth the rot they had tried to forget. When the shovels bit into the earth, the ground released its secrets, the gases bursting, the stench so overwhelming that men fainted. The guards forced them back up with kicks and rifle butts. There was no room for weakness in the factory of death. Wood was gathered, stacked high into pyres. The bodies were arranged carefully, logs below, corpses above, more wood on top. Fuel was poured. A match struck. Flames took hold with a low roar, orange light flickering across the trees. The fire devoured everything it touched, hissing and cracking as flesh and bone turned to ash. Smoke rose through the branches, thick and greasy, drifting for miles. Villagers saw it, and said it looked like the sky itself was burning. The guards joked that the smoke was a signal to Berlin. The men who tended the fires did not laugh. They stood motionless, watching the flames reflect in their eyes. Night in the forest was worse than day. The fires glowed through the darkness, lighting up the trunks like pillars of hell. The air was never still. The crackle of burning wood, the moan of wind, the occasional shot when a prisoner collapsed. The guards sometimes sang to break the monotony, their voices slurred with drink, their words lost to the roar of the flames. Beneath that terrible light, the forest no longer felt like a place of nature, but like a stage for the end of humanity. Every sound was magnified. The hiss of sap bursting, the soft thud of ash falling, the groan of trees bending under heat. The earth itself seemed to cry out, though no one heard it. As the burning continued, the prisoners' world shrank even further. They no longer spoke of home or family. Their days were measured in fires built, bodies burned, pits filled. The forest had stripped them of everything but instinct, to move, to obey, to survive one more hour. Yet somewhere in that desolation, a flicker of humanity remained. Some carved messages into tree trunks, short phrases in Hebrew, Polish, or Yiddish. Remember us, we were here. Others buried small tokens beneath roots, a button, a ring, a scrap of paper with a prayer. These gestures were acts of rebellion, fragile proofs that even among ashes, identity could not be entirely erased. For the SS, the forest became routine, just another extension of the camp. They built makeshift shelters for storage, designated paths for trucks, installed floodlights that turned night into a pale imitation of day. They kept records of fuel usage, wood consumption, and the number of units processed. Everything was counted, everything noted. Death had become a matter of supply and demand. The men who managed these operations took pride in their efficiency. They talked about the fires the way factory foremen talked about production lines. To them, the forest was not a graveyard. It was a workshop. When the wind shifted, the smoke from the pyres drifted toward the village of Kolo. The residents there began to see fine gray ash settling on their fields, coating crops, windows, and wells. They called it black snow. It came without warning, covering everything in silence. People wiped it from their clothes, not knowing it carried the remains of their neighbors, their friends, their community. Children drew shapes in it, unaware of what it was. The countryside itself became a participant in the crime, absorbing what the camp expelled. The guards grew careless over time. They drank more, argued, gambled. Some of them confessed to each other that the work was beginning to haunt them. A few claimed they saw movement in the pits at night, shadows that looked like the dead trying to climb out. The more superstitious spoke of hearing whispers in the wind, voices calling their names. They laughed about it in daylight, but when darkness fell, many refused to go near the graves. The forest, once silent, had begun to talk back. Among the prisoners, whispers of escape began to circulate. They knew it was suicide, but the alternative was worse. They watched the guards' patterns, the way the trucks arrived, the moments of distraction. One night, when the flames were burning low and the SS were drinking, a small group made their move. They slipped into the undergrowth, crawling on their stomachs through mud and ash, the smell of smoke still clinging to them. Shots rang out. 2 fell instantly. The others kept crawling, their breath ragged, their hands tearing against roots. By dawn, only one had reached the edge of the forest. His name was WW2. He would live long enough to tell the world what had happened here. The forest of Rzuczo became his testimony, even after he was gone. Through his words, the world learned of the pits, the smoke, the engines that brought death disguised as transport. His story was passed to the underground in Warsaw, then to London, and then to history itself. Yet, even after the truth was known, the forest kept its secrets. No photograph could capture the smell, the weight of the air, the silence that followed each truck. The trees grew back, the grass covered the mounds, and the birds eventually returned. But under every root, beneath every blade of grass, the earth still held traces of ash. When the war ended and investigators arrived, They found fragments scattered across the clearing. Bone shards, charred wood, rusted shell casings, a child's shoe. The forest, once a place of slaughter, had reverted to quiet, but it was not peace. It was the kind of silence that follows screaming, deep and permanent. The soil was darker here than anywhere else, and when it rained, the water ran gray. Local farmers avoided the place, saying it poisoned their dreams. Even today, when the wind moves through Rzuczo, it carries a strange sound. Not quite a whisper, not quite a sigh, but something in between. The villagers say it's the forest remembering. They say if you stand there long enough, you can still smell the smoke, still hear the low rumble of engines somewhere far off. The trees have grown tall again, their branches reaching toward the sky like arms in prayer. But they remain marked, scarred witnesses to the first industrialized graveyard in human history. As the chapter closes, the camera drifts upward, through the canopy, above the green sea of leaves that hides the scars below. The forest looks calm now, sunlight filtering through, birdsong faintly returning. But the voice of history lingers, heavy and unrelenting. Beneath the beauty lies a silence carved by engines and fire. Rzuczo still breathes, but what it exhales is memory, and memory, like the forest itself, never truly dies. Chapter 8. Daily Life of the Perpetrators. Morning in Chelmno began with a ritual that felt almost ordinary. The frost clung to the windows of the manor, and the chimneys exhaled thin plumes of smoke. In the yard, soldiers stretched, yawned, and stamped their boots against the cold ground. The air smelled faintly of diesel and burned wood, and for a brief moment, it could have been any garrison in occupied Poland. But beyond the stillness, beneath the calm of breakfast and routine, lay the truth of what they were. These men, dressed in black and gray, carrying notebooks, pistols, and cigarettes, were the operators of a killing machine. And what awaited them each day was not war, but the steady rhythm of extermination. The SS men who served at Chelmno lived in two worlds. In one, they were officers and bureaucrats, disciplined, organized, committed to procedure. In the other, they were participants in a horror so vast that words could barely contain it. Yet to them, it had become work, a profession, a duty, a task to complete with efficiency and precision. Their lives were structured around timetables, briefings, reports, and meals. They clocked in and out like factory workers. Their tools were trucks and pistols instead of machines and wrenches. The product they delivered was death. Inside the manor, breakfast was served promptly at 6. The cooks, Polish prisoners forced into service, prepare bread, butter, coffee, and sometimes meat brought from nearby farms. The officers ate together, their laughter echoing against the walls that only hours before had heard the cries of the condemned. Herbert Lang would sit at the head of the table, silent, sipping his coffee as he read through the previous day's reports. He was meticulous about documentation, numbers of transports, efficiency of operations, mechanical issues with the vans. The tone was always technical, always neutral. The word killed never appeared. Instead, phrases like delivered, processed, and special treatment completed filled the pages. To anyone reading the reports without context, it could have described a supply chain. After breakfast, orders were issued. The guards assembled in the courtyard, their breath misting in the cold air. Lang's second-in-command, Hans Bothman, spoke briskly, assigning tasks. Drivers were to test the engines. Mechanics were to inspect the hoses. Clerks were to prepare the manifests. Guards were to form ranks near the gate. There was no talk of morality, no reflection, only logistics. Killing at Chelmno was not driven by hatred. It was driven by procedure. The process was clean on paper, mechanical in motion, and monstrous in consequence. By mid-morning, the trucks began to arrive from the ghettos. The men moved into their positions with practiced ease. Some guarded the perimeter, others managed the crowd, some guided prisoners into the manor's basement. Each man knew his role. The key to Chelmno's success was its organization. Chaos was the enemy. If panic spread, The illusion of resettlement would collapse, and with it, efficiency. So the guard spoke softly, even kindly. They used the language of order and reassurance. They had learned that gentleness killed faster than cruelty. As the vans filled and departed, the courtyard emptied. The guards remained alert, smoking and waiting. Some joked among themselves, telling stories from home, trading gossip about promotions or transfers. They talked about their families, their farms, their pay. They were young, most in their 20s or 30s, and the banality of their conversations made the air feel heavier. A man who had just overseen the loading of 70 people into a gas van might discuss the best way to make sausage, or when he planned to return to Berlin to see his wife. The line between the human and the monstrous blurred completely. They were ordinary men performing extraordinary evil. The manor staff operated with similar detachment. The clerks worked at long wooden tables in rooms that smelled of ink and tobacco. They recorded names, tallied possessions, sorted documents, and stamped forms. The sound of typewriters echoed faintly down the hallways. The men wore crisp uniforms and spoke in low, formal voices. To them, the victims were not people, but entries on a ledger. Each line of ink was a life erased, and yet the clerks treated it like simple accounting. 226 units received. 226 units processed. In their minds, precision equaled professionalism. For the drivers and mechanics, the work was dirtier but equally methodical. They started the day with tools and oil, checking every valve and gasket on the gas vans. They reported engine problems, adjusted exhaust flow, and cleaned out the interiors with buckets of water and lime. The smell inside the vans was unbearable, a mixture of exhaust, blood, and bile that clung to their skin no matter how often they washed. Some wore scarves around their faces. Others smeared ointment beneath their noses to block the stench. They worked quickly, avoiding eye contact with the prisoners who watched from the sidelines. For them, the vehicles were machines to be maintained, not coffins on wheels. At noon, the guards gathered for lunch in the manor's dining hall. The windows were shuttered, the curtains drawn. They ate soup and bread, drank beer or schnapps, and shared jokes that made their comrades laugh and the servants flinch. The conversations were mundane, even cheerful. One man complained about the cold, another about the food, another about the monotony. Sometimes they played cards or listened to music on a gramophone brought from Germany. On the walls hung framed photographs, landscapes, family portraits, scenes of ordinary life that seemed to belong to another world. The juxtaposition was obscene. Laughter and warmth in the same building where, only meters away, the air reeked of death. After lunch came what they called maintenance. It was a euphemism for managing the aftermath, the emptying of vans, the collection of valuables, the disposal of bodies. The officers supervised from a distance, standing with clipboards and cigarettes while the Sonderkommando worked in silence. The prisoners dug, dragged, burned, and buried under watchful eyes. If one faltered, he was shot where he stood. The guards didn't flinch. They had seen it too many times. The rhythm of killing and cleaning had become routine, as predictable as the changing of shifts in a factory. In the evenings, when the last truck returned and the day's work was done, the manor came alive again with noise. Bottles clinked. Music played. Laughter spilled through the corridors. The men drank heavily. Alcohol dulled the edges of what they had done, made it easier to live with. Some played cards. Others sang songs from home. A few talked about the future, promotions, new assignments, vacations. There were moments of unease, too, when silence would briefly descend and someone's eyes would drift toward the window, toward the forest that lay in darkness beyond. But those moments were fleeting. A toast, a laugh, a joke about Berlin nightlife, and the unease vanished. The machine of denial was as well-oiled as the trucks in the yard. Not all men adapted the same way. Some became crueler, finding perverse satisfaction in their power. They beat prisoners without reason, mocked their suffering, stole jewelry for themselves. Others retreated inward, moving through each day like ghosts. A few developed tremors, insomnia, or nightmares. The camp doctor, an SS physician, provided them with morphine or sleeping pills. For the Reich, even its killers needed maintenance. Their mental stability was part of the system's efficiency. Weakness could not be allowed to interrupt the schedule. Lang himself embodied the system's cold professionalism. He rarely raised his voice, rarely showed anger. He kept to his quarters, reading reports, writing orders, maintaining the illusion of control. Those who served under him feared him, not because of outbursts, but because of his calm. He killed with silence. His presence alone demanded obedience. When he inspected the operations, he did so like an engineer examining a machine. If a truck was late, he noted it. If a guard hesitated, he recorded it. His only concern was output, numbers, speed, results. Humanity was a variable he had long since subtracted from the equation. The routine of the perpetrators followed the rhythm of the seasons. In winter, they cursed the cold and drank more. In summer, they complained about the flies and the smell from the forest. They built makeshift shelters to escape the heat and installed electric lights for working late. The killing never stopped. Even the weather was merely another inconvenience to manage. The men learned to joke about it. When the wind blows from the west, one driver said, "We dine on ashes." The others laughed. It was gallows humor in the truest sense. Laughter meant survival. In their free hours, some of the men wrote letters home. They described the countryside, the good food, the camaraderie of their comrades. They never mentioned the gas vans or the graves. Instead, they told their wives and mothers that they were on special duty, helping with resettlement. Some enclosed flowers pressed between the pages, or photographs of themselves standing proudly in uniform before the manor. To their families, they looked like ordinary soldiers serving their country. The lie was complete. The interactions between SS men and the Polish villagers added another layer of complexity. The locals brought supplies, food, fuel, repairs, and in return received payment or protection. Most avoided asking questions. They feared what they might learn. Yet even those who did not see inside the camp could not escape the smell, the smoke, the rumors. The men of Chelmno lived among civilians who knew something was wrong, but said nothing. Silence became a kind of complicity, enforced by fear. It allowed the perpetrators to continue without resistance. As the months passed, the men became desensitized. New arrivals to the camp sometimes vomited at the smell, fainted at their first glimpse of the pits. The veterans laughed at them, offering sardonic advice. "You'll get used to it," they said, and they did. Within weeks, the nausea faded, replaced by numbness. They stopped seeing faces. They stopped hearing cries. The human mind adapts to horror with terrifying speed. By the end of the year, even the most reluctant guard performed his duties without hesitation. But the numbness came with a price. When they slept, the dreams came, suffocating dreams of engines roaring and walls closing in. Some woke screaming, drenched in sweat, clutching their throats. Others turned to alcohol, so heavily that they could no longer stand straight by nightfall. Violence became both an outlet and a habit. Fights broke out in the barracks. Men struck one another over trivial insults. Some sought out local women, using force when refused. Power had corrupted them beyond repair, and the camp had stripped away whatever humanity they once possessed. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the facade cracked. Once, after a long day, a driver sat alone in the courtyard and wept quietly. Another time, a young guard asked a senior officer whether what they were doing was right. The officer stared at him, expressionless, and said, "It is necessary." That word, necessary, silenced the question forever. It was the justification for every act, every order, every body buried in the forest. In Chelmno, necessity replaced conscience. By night, the manor transformed again. The laughter grew louder, the songs more raucous. Bottles emptied faster. The men drank to forget, to quiet the pounding in their heads, to drown the memory of what they had seen. Some became violent, breaking furniture, shouting nonsense. Others collapsed into their bunks, snoring as the moonlight filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Outside, the forest smoldered faintly from the fires that still burned in the pits. The air was thick, unmoving, and filled with the low hum of insects drawn to the light. For the perpetrators, daily life at Chelmno was an illusion of normalcy built on the foundation of hell. They told themselves they were doing their duty, that history would understand. They convinced themselves that they were not monsters, but soldiers. But deep down, in the quiet moments between orders and sleep, they knew. They saw it in each other's eyes, in the way conversation faltered when the word Chelmno was spoken aloud. They carried the weight of their own actions like an invisible uniform they could never remove. As time went on, some were transferred to new posts, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, where they applied what they had learned in Chelmno. They took their expertise in killing with them, spreading it like a virus across occupied Europe. Others stayed, bound to the manor and its routine, until even they began to feel the pressure of the war closing in. But the rhythm remained unchanged. Breakfast, orders, trucks, smoke, laughter, sleep, day after day. And so the men who lived and worked in Chelmno continued their lives as if nothing around them was extraordinary. They built a routine so ordinary that the extraordinary evil of it disappeared beneath the surface. They could smile, sing, and eat while the forest burned outside their windows. They could fall in love with a melody on the radio while the ash of thousands drifted past the glass. That was their final transformation, not into demons, but into men who could murder the world and call it normal. When the last lights went out in the manor each night, the silence returned. The engines cooled, the laughter faded, and the forest resumed its endless vigil. But in the darkness, something remained, a residue, invisible but unshakable. It clung to the walls, to the air, to the souls of the men who believed they could kill and stay human. And in that silence, beneath the stars, Chelmno slept, not in peace, but in the uneasy stillness of a place that had forgotten the difference between duty and damnation. Chapter 9. Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to kill. The first time they were brought into the manor basement, they thought they had been spared. The men stood apart from the crowd, confused but relieved to still be alive after the others had been led away. A German officer told them they were to assist in resettlement duties. He spoke in a voice that almost sounded kind, and for a few fleeting moments, they believed it. These prisoners had been chosen for their strength, their youth, their usefulness. They didn't know yet that this usefulness was a death sentence deferred. They were not spared. They were enslaved to the machinery of extermination. They were the Sonderkommando, the living shadows of the dead. They were given little explanation at first. Only orders. Clean this, carry that, dig here. Their first task was to sort clothing from the previous day's arrivals. The piles filled entire rooms. Coats, shoes, scarves, and small, familiar things. Photographs, toys, letters. Each item still carried the scent of the person who had worn it. One man found his neighbor's jacket among the heap. Another saw a child's mitten stitched with his family's initials. That was the moment when they began to understand. These are not deportations. There was no resettlement. Everyone who had entered the trucks was dead. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like a chill through a cracked door. The prisoners watched as guards loaded the next group of victims into the vans. They heard the muffled pounding, the sudden silence, and then saw the trucks return, heavy and reeking. They were ordered to open the doors. What fell out was no longer human. A heap of bodies, twisted, blue, and motionless. The men stood frozen, their hands trembling, their minds trying to reject what their eyes had already accepted. A guard shouted and struck one of them with a rifle, but, "Move," he barked. "You will get used to it." That sentence became their daily prophecy. Their work began at dawn. The SS woke them with shouts, thrusting shovels and wheelbarrows into their hands. They were marched through the forest path to the pits, where the ground steamed with decay. The smell was unbearable, a choking mix of gas, sweat, and decomposing flesh. It clung to their clothes, their skin, their hair. They were not allowed to cover their faces. They worked until their arms shook, dragging bodies, stacking them in trenches, sprinkling lime to hasten decomposition. The guards watched, shouting orders, laughing, sometimes shooting one at random to remind the rest of their place. Every motion, every breath, every beat of their hearts was bound to death. At night, they were locked in the manor's cellar, forbidden to speak. They lay in silence, listening to the engines outside, the faint cries of the next transport. Sleep never came. When they closed their eyes, they saw faces, eyes still open, mouths frozen mid-prayer. They dreamed of the forest swallowing them whole, of sinking into the same pits they had filled. Some whispered to each other in the dark, telling themselves that survival meant bearing witness. Others prayed for death, believing that dying would be the only escape from the burden of what they were forced to do. The SS treated the Sonderkommando as disposable tools. They were never allowed to forget it. Every few weeks, new laborers were chosen from incoming transports, and the old ones were taken to the forest and shot. The turnover was systematic. No witnesses were meant to live long enough to tell the world what they had seen. Yet in those fleeting weeks between arrival and execution, these men saw more of the truth than anyone else alive. They saw how methodical murder could be. They saw the complete absence of hesitation in those who gave the orders. And they saw what it meant to lose one's humanity not by choice, but by force. They worked in teams. Some dragged bodies from the vans. Others stripped them of clothing and valuables. Others carried them to the graves. The tasks rotated, but none were better than the others. The worst, perhaps, was handling the children, so small that two could be lifted with one arm. They had to pry fingers apart, unfasten jewelry, cut hair from women's heads to be sent to factories in Germany. Each action was mechanical, but each one chipped away at their souls. Some tried to protect what dignity they could by covering the faces of the dead, by whispering the Shema, the ancient Jewish prayer, under their breath as they worked. They were not just killing the dead. They were burying the last fragments of themselves. There were moments of collapse. One man, after days of digging, suddenly dropped his shovel and screamed, tearing at his clothes. He cried out his wife's name again and again until a guard shot him through the neck. The others kept digging. They didn't flinch. They couldn't. Any reaction was dangerous. To live another hour meant to obey, to move, to become less visible. Survival required silence. It was a discipline learned through terror. Despite the horror, humanity still found tiny cracks through which to breathe. The Sonderkommando helped each other when they could. They shared stolen bread, a sip of water, a whispered word of comfort. When one man faltered under the weight of a body, another would help him lift it. When someone's eyes filled with tears, a quiet hand might rest briefly on his shoulder. A forbidden gesture, but one that said, without words, "I still see you." Those fleeting moments were rebellion in their purest form. In a place designed to erase compassion, they created it anew, if only for seconds at a time. The guards referred to them with contempt, calling them stinkers or gravediggers. They avoided touching them, avoided even looking at them too long. It was as if the SS believed proximity to these men might infect them with guilt. Yet without the Sonderkommando, the camp could not function. They were essential, invisible, and despised. The paradox defined their existence, needed but unwanted, alive but already condemned. When the cremations began, their work changed. Now they were ordered to exhume bodies, to build pyres, to burn the evidence. They worked in choking smoke that filled their lungs with ash. The heat was unbearable, and the fires roared day and night. They were forced to stir the ashes with metal rods, to crush bones that refused to burn completely, to scatter the remains into the wind. They watched the transformation of bodies into nothingness, and they understood that the Nazis were trying to erase not only lives, but the proof that those lives had ever existed. Still, even as the flames devoured the evidence, the Sonderkommando remembered. They remembered everything. There were small acts of defiance. Some men buried fragments of documents beneath the trees, believing someone might one day find them. Others scratched words into the bark of trees or the walls of the cellar. Names, prayers, pleas. A few managed to hide notes on their bodies, describing the camp's operations in precise detail. One of them, Slama Br Weiner, escaped in early 1942, carrying with him the story of Chelmno's gas vans and the forced graves. His testimony reached the Polish underground and then the world. Through him, the voices of those who could not escape began to speak. But for those who remained, the days blended into one another. Time lost meaning. There was no morning, no night, only work. They measured their existence by the number of bodies moved, the number of fires fed, the number of guards who passed by without shooting. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but the guards rationed food strictly. The weak were executed as examples. Disease spread easily, but even sickness was not enough to stop the routine. The machinery of death had no sympathy for the living, even those who maintained it. When rain came, it turned the forest into mud. The pits filled with water, and the bodies floated to the surface, their faces pale and bloated. The men waded through the muck, pushing the corpses back down with poles. The sight became ordinary. Horror had no meaning left. The only thing that broke the rhythm was the occasional transport of new prisoners selected to replace those who had been killed. The Sonderkommando would watch the new men arrive, terrified and confused, and feel a strange mix of pity and envy. Pity, because they knew what awaited them. Envy, because they also knew that these men would not yet have to live with the memories that they carried. At night, the guards sometimes got drunk and mocked them. They would force the prisoners to sing, to dance, to entertain them. The men obeyed, moving like puppets, their voices cracking under the weight of humiliation. When the guards grew bored, they might shoot one for sport. The others would carry the body away, clean the blood from the floor, and go back to work. The degradation was constant, but within that degradation, the Sonderkommando found strange clarity. They no longer feared death, only forgetting. To die without being remembered was the ultimate victory of their oppressors. So they began to memorize everything: the faces of the guards, the numbers on the trucks, the timing of the gassings. Memory became their rebellion. There were those who still clung to faith. A rabbi among them, his beard singed and his eyes hollow, led whispered prayers before dawn. He told the men that their suffering was not meaningless, that every act of kindness they performed defied the logic of their captors. One night, as they gathered in the cellar, he recited the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. When he finished, a guard overheard and beat him until he could no longer stand. But the men continued to whisper the prayer every night after that, their lips moving silently in the dark. By the end of 1942, the number of Sonderkommando who had passed through Chelmno was in the hundreds. Almost all of them were dead. The SS executed them in small groups, replacing them as easily as they replaced the tires on their trucks. The killings were swift, methodical, without ceremony. A man would be ordered to step forward, told to kneel, and shot in the back of the head. The next would step forward, and so on, until the floor was slick with blood. When the shooting was done, a new team would arrive the next day to bury them. The system consumed even its own servants. When the camp was temporarily shut down in early 1943, the few remaining Sonderkommando were ordered to destroy every trace of the operation. They dug up the last of the graves, burned the remaining bodies, and leveled the forest floor. The manor was cleaned and stripped of evidence. Then they were told to march into the woods for relocation. They knew what that meant. Some refused to walk, others ran, a few fought back with their bare hands. The gunfire echoed for minutes, then silence returned. The forest, once again, closed its mouth over their graves. But memory is stubborn. Against every plan to erase them, the Sonderkommando endured through the fragments they left behind, through the testimony of escapees, through the prayers scratched into walls, through the soil itself, which still carries traces of their ashes. They were men forced to act as instruments of destruction, Yet they carried within them the final, fragile resistance of human conscience. And when historians and survivors later spoke of Chelmno, it was through the eyes of those who were forced to see everything. The men who had no choice but to look into the abyss each day and still remain human enough to remember. Their story is not one of redemption, but of endurance, of what it means to live at the edge of annihilation and still recognize, however faintly, the spark of humanity flickering within. As the chapter closes, the night settles once again over the forest. The manor stands in shadow. The engines are silent. Only the wind moves through the trees, carrying whispers of the men who were forced to kill so others could forget. Their work ended long ago, but their presence lingers in the soil, in the smoke, in the pages of history that refuse to let them vanish. They were the witnesses of the end of the world, and through their memory, the world was forced to see itself and never look away again. Chapter 10. Silence beyond the forest. The forest slept under a shroud of mist. The manor stood empty, its windows dark, its walls damp from years of quiet rot. The birds that once fled from the noise had returned, nesting in the eaves, filling the air with song that felt wrong against the history buried beneath their feet. Chelmno had gone still. The trucks no longer came. The guards had vanished. The Sonderkommando were gone, their graves indistinguishable from the earth they had turned. For the first time in 2 years, the forest no longer echoed with the sound of engines. It was over, at least for now. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was the kind of silence that follows a scream, when the air itself feels heavy with what it has heard. When the last orders came from Berlin in early 1943, they were simple: dismantle, erase, forget. Operation Reinhard was expanding eastward, and the system of extermination had evolved. Chelmno's crude efficiency had served its purpose. Its lessons had been absorbed by larger, more industrial machines, the fixed gas chambers of Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka. The SS officers who had refined their methods here were reassigned, carrying with them the knowledge of mechanized death. Chelmno, once the first prototype of total annihilation, was to be buried, literally and figuratively. Lang and Bothman oversaw the closure with the same cold precision they had once used to organize mass murder. No evidence was to remain. The world, they believed, would never know. The manor was cleaned meticulously. The walls were scrubbed. The rooms where victims had undressed were repainted. The cellars were emptied and sealed. In the forest, the work was grimmer. The last remaining prisoners were forced to dig up the graves and burn whatever remnants they found. Flesh turned to ash, bones to powder. The stench carried for miles, mingling with the smoke that rose in a pale, gray haze over the trees. It was as if the earth itself was exhaling one last breath of the dead before swallowing them forever. When the fires finally died down, the men who had performed this work were shot. The forest, once again, became a grave. The Germans erected a small farmhouse near the site and stationed a handful of guards to maintain appearances. To passing villagers, Chelmno looked like farmland again. The roads were quiet, the manor's gates locked, the air strangely calm. The locals, who had spent 2 years pretending not to see the smoke, began to speak of the place only in whispers. They called it cursed. No one went near the forest after dark. Those who did claim to hear sounds, faint knocking, distant crying, the echo of engines that no longer ran. Superstition became the only way to describe what reason could not. For months, the village tried to forget, but forgetting was impossible. The signs of what had happened were everywhere. The soil, when disturbed, released a foul odor that no rain could wash away. In spring, flowers grew unusually thick over certain patches of ground, their colors brighter, fed by what lay beneath. Children playing in the woods sometimes found bones, small and pale, mistaken for animal remains until adults saw the shape of a human hand. The river nearby turned black during the thaw, carrying ash that settled along its banks. Chelmno's silence was never complete. It spoke in the language of the natural world, reminding those who try to deny it that the dead do not rest easily when their story is unfinished. In the absence of the SS, scavengers came. They were poor villagers, desperate for anything that could be traded or sold. They dug near the edges of the pits, searching for jewelry, coins, or gold teeth the guard might have missed. Some carried away buttons or rings, others only scraps of cloth. They worked at night, using lanterns and shovels, whispering to each other as if afraid of waking the forest. For every coin found, there were 10 faces that stared back at them from their dreams. The guilt was a curse they would carry for life. Many stopped coming after a few nights, convinced that the forest was haunted. Maybe it was. Maybe it still is. When the front lines shifted and the Red Army began its slow push westward, the Germans grew nervous. In late 1944, as reports reached Berlin that the Soviets were advancing through Poland, orders were given to restart Chelmno's operation. Not to resume killing on a large scale, but to erase what remained. A small detachment of SS men returned, led once again by Hans Bothmann. They reopened the manor, reassembled a small group of Jewish prisoners, and began exhuming the graves once more. The fires burned again, not to take lives but to destroy evidence. The forest filled with smoke that winter, thick and black, the sky glowing red at night, as though the earth itself were trying to tell the world what had been hidden. The new Sonderkommando understood immediately what their fate would be. They knew they were not digging for others, but for themselves. Among them was a man named Simon Treblinka, just 13 years old, who would later become one of the very few survivors of Chelmno. He remembered the heat of the flames, the constant roar of the fires, and the smell that hung in the air like a curse. The guards joked while they worked, drinking schnapps and playing gramophone records. The contrast between their laughter and the sight of bones burning beneath the open sky was unbearable. To Treblinka, it felt like living inside a nightmare that had no beginning and no end. By early January 1945, as the Soviets approached, Bothmann ordered the final liquidation of the camp. The prisoners were locked in the barn near the manor and shot through the walls. Only 2 escaped, crawling through the snow under cover of darkness while bullets whistled past them. They ran until they could no longer feel their legs, collapsing in the frozen fields beyond the forest. One was caught and killed. The other, Simon Treblinka, survived. He was rescued by Polish villagers days later, his face burned, his eyes hollow. He was one of only 2 known survivors of Chelmno out of more than 150,000 people who had been murdered there. When the Soviet troops arrived, they found almost nothing. The manor was a ruin. The gas vans were gone. The graves had been dug up and burned. What remained were fragments, bone shards mixed with ash, melted metal, teeth scattered among the roots. Investigators walked through the forest in silence, boots sinking into soft earth that still smelled faintly of smoke. They found traces of burned human fat in the soil, small pieces of jewelry, and the charred remains of children's shoes. It was enough to tell the story, even if the evidence was thin. The land itself had become a witness. In the months that followed, Chelmno remained eerily untouched. The villagers avoided it, the soldiers moved on, and the government was slow to acknowledge what had happened. There were other camps now, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, each one larger, more infamous, more documented. Chelmno became a shadow, the quiet beginning of something too vast to comprehend. For years, it was spoken of only in whispers among survivors, as though saying its name might summon the ghosts back. But ghosts have their own ways of returning. In the late 1940s, a team of investigators and historians arrived to study the site. They interviewed survivors, gathered testimonies, and walked through the forest, measuring, mapping, and collecting fragments. They found traces of the cremation pits, the outlines of the trenches, the remains of the manor's foundations. They documented what they could, but the forest resisted revelation. It had swallowed the evidence too well. The wind erased footprints as quickly as they appeared. When the men stopped to rest, they said they could still smell ash in the air, even after rain. One of them wrote in his report, "This place is not a ruin. It is an echo." In the decades that followed, Chelmno faded into obscurity compared to the larger death camps. It lacked the iconic images, the train platforms, the barbed wire fences. There were no vast barracks, no chimneys standing as monuments. It was too rural, too quiet, too thoroughly erased. Yet it was here that the machinery of death first learned to run smoothly. It was here that killing was transformed from chaos into system. Chelmno was the prototype, the first draft of a nightmare perfected elsewhere. The Nazis believed that because it was small, because it was buried in a forest, history would forget it. But history, like the earth, has a long memory. Over time, the survivors' testimonies became the only light in that darkness. Men like Simon Treblinka and Mordecai Pochlebnik told their stories in courtrooms, interviews, and documentaries. Their voices quiet but unflinching. They described the smell of exhaust, the heat of the fires, the hollow faces of the guards. When asked how it felt to survive, Treblinka said, "It was not living, it was remembering." His words carried the weight of all who had perished. For the world to hear him speak was to confront the truth that evil does not disappear when the engines stop. It lingers in memory, waiting for silence to give it room to return. In 1961, when Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem, the name Chelmno surfaced again. Prosecutors read from testimonies and reports. The court heard of gas vans, of burial pits, of the forest that became a furnace. Few in the audience had ever heard of the place. For many, it was the first time they realized that the Holocaust had begun not in the camps of Auschwitz, but in a small Polish village where the sound of a diesel engine was the sound of death. Chelmno was not an afterthought of genocide. It was its beginning. Today, the site is a memorial. The forest has grown back, the men are long gone. A museum stands where the farm once was, filled with artifacts, buttons, shoes, documents, fragments of bone. The air there feels different, as if it carries the weight of history in every breath. Visitors walk along the same paths where the victims once marched, past quiet trees and gentle grass that hides the graves beneath. There are no fences, no guards, only silence. And in that silence, the past speaks louder than any voice could. Every year, survivors and their descendants gather there to light candles, to read names that have no graves. The list is endless. Entire families erased, entire towns wiped away. They stand together in the forest, listening to the wind move through the trees. And for a moment, time feels suspended. It is not mourning alone that fills the air, but defiance. Each candle, each name, each breath is a statement. You tried to erase us, and we are still here. As night falls, the forest darkens once more. The stars appear above the trees, reflecting faintly in the river that runs nearby. The same river that once carried ashes now carries light. The world beyond Chelmno continues. Cities, laughter, new generations. But the memory remains embedded in the soil. The silence that once followed the last truck's engine is no longer emptiness. It is remembrance. Chelmno began as a secret, but history has no patience for secrets. The forest may have swallowed its evidence, but not its story. That story lives on in every survivor's testimony, in every archive, in every whisper of wind through the WW2 trees. It is a reminder that even the smallest places can bear the weight of unimaginable evil, and that silence, left unbroken, can become complicity. As the camera drifts through the trees one last time, the viewer hears nothing but the sound of wind, soft, endless, eternal. And within that wind, if one listens closely, there is something else, not the roar of engines anymore, but the echo of names. Thousands of them, carried through the branches, refusing to be forgotten. Chelmno's story ends not in smoke, but in the enduring defiance of memory. The silence beyond the forest is not absence. It is the world's promise to remember. Chapter 11. Return of the Killers. When the wind began to shift in late 1944, the sound of the front could already be heard faintly across western Poland. Distant rumbling, a tremor beneath the frozen ground. The Red Army was advancing, swallowing town after town, and word spread quickly through the German ranks. The East was collapsing. For most of occupied Poland, this meant the end of terror. But for Chelmno, for the force that had gone quiet and cold, it meant something else. It meant the return of the men who had built it, the ones who could not leave ghosts unburied. They came back not to rebuild, but to destroy the evidence of what they had created. The killers returned to erase their own footprints. The manor still stood when Hans Bothmann and his men arrived that November. The windows were shattered, the doors hanging from their hinges, the walls covered in frost and silence. Grass and weeds had begun to crawl through the cracks in the courtyard. The forest had reclaimed what humans had abandoned. Bothmann stepped from his car, his breath clouding in the cold air, and stared at the house as if greeting an old friend. Behind him, a convoy of trucks idled, engines humming, headlights cutting through the mist. Inside those trucks were the tools of the past: shovels, axes, barrels of fuel, and the living laborers who would once again be forced to serve death. The new Sonderkommando were few, barely 30 men, taken from nearby ghettos that had somehow survived until the last year of the war. Among them were the very young and the very old, chosen because their lives, in the eyes of the Reich, were worth nothing. They arrived chained, thin as shadows, shivering in their rags. The SS guards who met them gave no explanation, only orders. They were told to clean the manor, to repair the roofs, to dig. They did not yet know that they were digging up the dead. Inside the manor, the returning SS officers re-established their routines, as if no time had passed. Bothmann took over Lang's old quarters upstairs, setting his pistol on the table beside a bottle of schnapps. He wrote in his diary, composed reports, and issued orders with the same cold detachment he had perfected years before. He was a man who had already seen too much to be haunted by it. To him, Chelmno was just another assignment. Unpleasant, perhaps, but necessary. His men followed his example. They unpacked their uniforms, reassembled their gramophone, and settled back into the rhythm of the place, as if the last 2 years had been an intermission rather than an ending. The manor came alive again with the same contradictions it had always carried. In the mornings, there was laughter over breakfast, the clatter of cutlery, the sound of boots on stone. In the afternoons, the trucks arrived at the forest, and the air filled with the smell of burning flesh. In the evenings, the officers drank and played cards, telling jokes under the same roof where their prisoners lay chained in the cellar. Evil had memory here. It recognized its old corridors. The forest was different now. The graves had settled into uneven mounds, the earth heavy and dark. Frost covered everything, giving the illusion of purity. But when the shovels hit the ground, the illusion shattered. The soil was soft beneath the ice, soaked with fat and ash. The smell came almost instantly, sweet, sickly, unforgettable. The men retched as they dug. The SS guards laughed, calling them weaklings, ordering them to dig faster. "This is what your people left behind," one shouted. "Now you will clean it." The words were cruel, but there was fear behind them too. The guards could feel history catching up, the noose tightening. They needed this evidence gone before it arrived in Soviet hands. For weeks, the prisoners dug from dawn until nightfall. They uncovered what remained of the graves. Bones fused together, skulls cracked by pressure, fragments of clothing still clinging to the earth. They pulled out hundreds, then thousands of remains, stacking them like logs for burning. Every time the fires were lit, the smoke rose high above the trees, visible for miles. Villagers nearby saw it again, the same gray columns they had thought gone forever, and whispered to each other in fear. They knew what it meant. The dead had been disturbed. The nightmare had come back. The fires burned day and night, their light flickering against the bare winter branches. The prisoners were ordered to crush the bones that remained after burning, to sift through the ash for gold teeth or jewelry. The sound of grinding bone mixed with the crackle of flames, creating a rhythm that haunted those who survived. One of them, years later, would say, It was as if the earth was screaming through us. The men worked with numb hands and empty eyes, their faces lit by fire. They did not speak. To speak was to break the fragile wall that kept madness at bay. Both men visited the forest often, walking the line of the pits with his hands behind his back. He spoke rarely, only to give orders. He carried himself with the calm of a man who believed he could still control fate. His subordinates, however, were less certain. Some drank heavily, muttering about the Russians. Others grew paranoid, hearing noises in the woods at night, twigs snapping, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. They began to see figures in the mist, shapes that looked like people moving among the trees. The prisoners noticed it too. They said the forest was full of souls. The guards called it nonsense, but few dared to go out alone after dark. Among the new prisoners was young Simon Treblinka, barely a teenager, but with eyes that had already seen the end of the world. He was small, quiet, and obedient, qualities that made him invisible to the guards. They assigned him to tend fires and carry water. He learned quickly, saying nothing, doing exactly what he was told. At night, when the others slept, he lay awake listening to the distant rumble of artillery from the east. He knew the war was closing in. He began to plan, not out of hope, but out of instinct, the simple, stubborn will to live one more day. By January 1945, the Red Army was less than 30 kilometers away. Panic spread among the SS. Both men knew the end was near. The manor cellar was filled with documents, uniforms, and the remnants of years of operations, all of it incriminating. The orders came quickly: destroy everything. The prisoners were made to haul crates of records into the yard, pour gasoline over them, and set them ablaze. Papers fluttered into the sky like black snow. Names, dates, numbers, all vanished into the air. The SS officers stood watching as the fire consumed their history. For a moment, it looked almost like a funeral for memory itself. Then came the final order. On January 17th, the prisoners were told to gather in the barn near the manor. The guards told them they would be moved west, away from the front. Some believed it, others did not. They entered silently, the door closing behind them. From outside, the SS surrounded the building. Both men gave a single nod. The machine guns opened fire through the walls, bullets tearing through wood and flesh. The sound was deafening, a storm of violence that lasted only minutes. When it stopped, the guards stepped inside to finish the job. They walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who still moved. The floor ran dark with blood. The smell of gunpowder mixed with smoke, and death once more filled Chelmno. But not everyone died. In the chaos, 2 men managed to crawl through a gap in the wall, dragging themselves through the snow toward the forest. Bullets whizzed past them, voices shouted, dogs barked. They ran until they could no longer hear the shouts, until the cold burned their lungs and the blood froze on their clothes. One fell behind and was caught. The other, Treblinka, kept running. He reached the river, half frozen, and crossed it by walking over floating ice. When he reached the far bank, he collapsed. Villagers found him the next morning and hid him in a barn until the Soviets arrived. He would later become one of the last living witnesses of Chelmno, a boy who had seen death return to the forest twice and had outlived it both times. The Germans left soon after. Both man and his men loaded their trucks and fled west, setting fire to the manor behind them. Flames consumed the last evidence of their crimes. The roof collapsed with a groan, sending sparks into the cold air. The road out of Chelmno was lined with snow, and the sound of engines faded into the distance. By the time the Soviets arrived days later, the site was nothing but ashes and silence. The forest, once again, swallowed its dead. When the investigators walked through the ruins, they found only traces: charred wood, fragments of bone, a single melted button. They interviewed the villagers, who spoke in hushed tones, their eyes downcast. They told of smoke in the night, of screams carried by the wind, of the smell that never left the soil. They spoke of a boy found half dead by the river. His name was Simon, they said, and he had told them everything. The Soviet officers listened, took notes, and nodded grimly. There was little else to do. The evidence had already been burned. In the months that followed, rumors spread that both men had died on the run, killed by his own men or shot by partisans. Some said he had escaped to Germany and lived under a false name. Others believed he had taken his own life rather than face capture. His body was never found. For the villagers, it didn't matter. They said the forest would deal with him eventually. Justice, they believed, might not come from courts but from the land itself, the same land he had filled with the dead. As for the site, it was left untouched for years. The ruins of the manor crumbled into the earth. Trees grew over the ashes. The barn where the last prisoners were killed collapsed under its own weight, its timbers rotting in the damp air. Nature reclaimed what humanity had desecrated, yet the ground remained poisoned, not by chemicals but by memory. Those who tried to build on it said the soil refused to hold foundations, that roots twisted around unseen things. When the wind blew from the east, the villagers said it carried the smell of smoke even decades later. When the war finally ended, the truth of Chelmno emerged slowly, pieced together from fragments, from Treblinka's testimony, from scattered documents, from bones that still surfaced after every heavy rain. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle no one wanted to complete. The return of the killers had nearly succeeded in erasing their crime, but not completely. They had destroyed evidence, not history. The forest itself had become the archive. Every root, every layer of soil, every gust of wind carried the echo of what they had done. Years later, when Treblinka was asked how it felt to return to Chelmno for a documentary, he said quietly, "It's like walking on ashes. The ground remembers everything." He stood in the same clearing where he had once tended fires, his voice calm, but his eyes distant. Around him, the forest swayed gently, green and alive, indifferent to human sorrow. Yet beneath that calm, the memory of what happened remained, not in stone or steel, but in silence. The killers had come back once to erase their crimes, but in doing so, they had written themselves into history more deeply than ever. Their attempt to silence the truth had only ensured that the forest would speak for them. And in that eternal, heavy quiet of Chelmno, one can still feel their failure. A silence so deep it hums, a silence that knows the difference between forgetting and forgiveness. The return of the killers was their final act, their last deception, but the forest did not forget. It never will. Chapter 12. The Witnesses Speak. When the gunfire finally stopped and the engines fell silent, the world outside Chelmno began to move again. The front advanced westward, the Reich collapsed, and the earth that had swallowed so many began, slowly, to return its secrets. But for a long time, the voices that could tell the truth about this place were almost gone. Most had been silenced in the same forest that had devoured their families. Only a handful remained, and their words, trembling, hesitant, fractured by memory, would have to carry the weight of 150,000 souls. History would depend on them, these few who had crawled from the abyss and somehow lived long enough to tell what they had seen. In the spring of 1945, the forest of WW2 stood bare. The snow had melted into black mud, revealing fragments scattered everywhere. Bones, buttons, hairpins, bits of wire. The manor was a ruin, the air still thick with the residue of burned wood and ash. Soviet investigators arrived first, stepping carefully through the wreckage, their boots sinking into soft ground that gave off the faintest smell of rot. They found the outlines of the cremation pits, the collapsed barn where the last prisoners had been executed, and a scattering of human remains that the Germans had failed to destroy. But without witnesses, it was all shadow and silence. The forest could only whisper. The dead could not speak. Then, one day a boy appeared. He was barely 14, small, pale, with a scar running across his jaw. His name was Simon Treblinka. He had been found by villagers days after the massacre, half frozen and barely breathing, hiding in a barn not far from the Riverna. When the soldiers brought him to the ruins, he stood quietly, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. He said he knew this place. He said he had worked here. And then, in a voice that wavered between childhood and something far older, he began to tell his story. He spoke of the return of the Germans, of the fires that filled the forest in the last months of the war. He spoke of the men forced to dig up the graves, to burn the bones, to grind the ashes into dust. He told them how he had seen the SS shoot his comrades in the barn, and how he had crawled through the hole in the wall, running into the night as bullets tore through the air. His story was so precise, so vivid, that even the hardened investigators fell silent. When he finished, one of them wrote simply in his notebook, "This child has seen hell." Simon was not alone. Another survivor, Mordecai Pochlebnik, had escaped from Chelmno in 1942 during one of the early transports. He had lived in hiding for years before resurfacing after the war. His memory was fragmented by time and fear, but the pieces he carried fit perfectly into the story Simon told. Together, they reconstructed the anatomy of the camp, the trucks, the manor, the pits, the forest. Between them, they described what no camera had ever captured: the transformation of a small Polish village into a laboratory of annihilation. In the ruins of Europe, their testimonies were seeds of truth. They spoke before tribunals and commissions, their words transcribed into official documents, their trembling voices becoming evidence in a world desperate to understand how civilization had turned against itself. But the cost of speaking was immense. Every word reopened wounds that had never healed. Every sentence dragged them back into the smell, the screams, the faces of those they could not save. After each testimony, Simon would sit for hours in silence, staring at the ground, as if part of him was still trapped behind the manor walls. At first, few believed them. Chelmno was too invisible, too quiet. It had no railway platform, no barbed wire fences, no chimneys stretching into the sky like at Auschwitz. It was too simple, too small, to contain such horror. People thought they were exaggerating or mistaken. But the investigators dug where Simon and Pochlebnik pointed, and each spadeful of earth proved them right. Beneath the surface lay the ash of thousands. The forest gave up its truth slowly, reluctantly, like a body exhaling its last breath. The trials began in Poland, then in Germany. The world wanted names, faces, perpetrators. But the machinery of justice moved slowly, and many of those responsible had already vanished into new lives, wearing new uniforms, living behind new walls. Still, the witnesses came forward. Survivors from nearby villages, railway workers, even a few German guards who had broken ranks. All spoke of what they had seen. Their testimonies overlapped, painting a picture so precise that denial became impossible. In 1946, at the first post-war trials in Lodz, the truth of Chelmno was laid bare in public for the first time. Mordecai Pochlebnik stood before the court, his hands shaking, his voice low. He spoke in Yiddish through an interpreter. He described the gas vans, the trucks that looked ordinary but carried death inside them. He told how the people were ordered to undress, how they believed they were being disinfected, how the doors were shut, and the engine started. His words were simple, almost clinical, as though he feared that too much emotion might make them unbelievable. They screamed for a while, he said, then they were quiet. The courtroom fell silent. Even the stenographers stopped typing. Years later, when Simon Srebnick testified at the trials in Germany, he was no longer a child. His hair had begun to gray, but his voice still carried the gentleness of youth. He told the same story, each detail unchanged. The judges listened, the translators repeated his words, and in the back of the courtroom, journalists scribbled notes. When the defense lawyer asked how he could possibly remember so much after so many years, Simon looked at him and said softly, "You don't forget a place like that." His words became a refrain for every survivor who followed. They did not speak for fame or for vengeance, but because silence would have been worse. They spoke because the forest still breathed beneath their feet, because the ghosts still followed them in dreams, because history has a way of dying when no one gives it voice. Yet for every survivor who spoke, dozens remained silent. Some could not bear it. Others found no one willing to listen. The world was rebuilding, and there was little room for those whose eyes still saw smoke rising through the trees. In the years that followed, the testimonies of Chelmno survivors would appear in books, trials, and archives, but their voices remained faint compared to the thunder of other atrocities. Auschwitz, with its vastness and documentation, became the symbol of the Holocaust. Chelmno was too intimate, too early, too efficiently erased. It was the whisper behind the scream. Even so, the witnesses refused to let it vanish. When historians came, they guided them through the forest, pointing out where the manor had stood, where the vans had loaded, where the pits still lay hidden under moss and grass. They became the living map of a vanished place. For Simon Treblinka, memory was both a duty and a wound that never closed. In 1979, he returned to Chelmno for the first time in decades, accompanied by a film crew led by French director Claude Lanzmann. They were making a documentary, Shoah, that would try to capture the Holocaust not through archives, but through the living voices of those who had seen it. The camera followed Simon as he walked through the village, through the forest, to the river where he had escaped. The locals watched him in uneasy silence. Some remembered him, others pretended not to. When he stood in the clearing and sang a Polish song he had been forced to perform for the SS, his voice trembled in the cold air, childlike and ancient all at once. It was the sound of memory refusing to die. Mordecai Pochlebnik also returned for the film. He walked the same path through the trees, explaining each corner, each mound, each memory. At one point, he stopped and looked at the ground. "Here," he said, "is where the bones were." His voice broke. "You cannot see them now, but they are here. They will always be here." The camera did not move. Lanzmann later said it was the only time in his career he had to look away from the lens. Other witnesses followed: railway workers who had watched the trucks pass, villagers who had smelled the smoke, local priests who had heard confessions from Germans after the war. Each spoke a fragment of the truth. Together, those fragments built a monument made not of stone but of words. Through their testimonies, Chelmno lived again, not as a place of death, but as a warning, a memory, a testament to how easily civilization can build hell with its own hands. But memory was fragile. As years passed, deniers emerged, voices that called the Holocaust exaggerated or fabricated. They pointed to the absence of structures at Chelmno, to the silence of the forest, and claimed it proved nothing had happened. The witnesses stood against them, aging, frail, but unshaken. "The forest remembers," said Simon. "You cannot argue with the earth." And when he died in 2006, it felt as if the last living echo of that place had finally dimmed. But the echoes he left behind, the recordings, the transcripts, the images, ensured that Chelmno would never vanish again into the silence from which it was born. The legacy of these witnesses was not only their words but their endurance. They had lived through an experience meant to erase them completely. They had carried that knowledge for decades, through trials, through disbelief, through nightmares that never left them. When asked what it meant to survive, Pochlebnik once said, "To survive is to remember for those who cannot. Every breath I take belongs to them." In those words lies the essence of what it means to bear witness. Not to heal, not to forget, but to carry the unbearable so the world will not repeat it. And yet, even with all their courage, the act of remembering was lonely. Many survivors lived in poverty, displaced, estranged from families who could not understand. The world often turned away, unwilling to look too closely at the reflection these people carried. But whenever they stood before a classroom, a courtroom, or a camera, they brought the dead with them. Every testimony was a resurrection, every memory a refusal to let Chelmno die a second time through forgetting. In the end, the witnesses did more than tell a story. They built a bridge between silence and truth, between denial and remembrance. They gave faces back to the faceless, names back to the nameless, and meaning back to a place that had been designed to strip all meaning away. Their words remain, written in archives and carved into memorials, echoing across generations. The world may change, the forest may grow thick again, but their voices will not fade. And so, as history moves forward, the forest of Rzuczo still listens. The wind moves through its branches, carrying the whispers of those who once stood among its trees and spoke the truth of what they saw. In that sound, faint but unbroken, the witnesses still speak, reminding the living that silence is not peace, that forgetting is not forgiveness, and that as long as memory survives, even the smallest voice can stand against the machinery of oblivion. Chapter 13. Trials of the Guilty. When the war finally ended, the world was a graveyard that stretched from the Vistula to the Rhine. Cities lay in ruins, armies disarmed, and flags that once declared empire fluttered in surrender. But while nations began to rebuild, justice stirred slowly, uncertainly, like a wounded thing learning to walk. The scale of the crimes was beyond comprehension, and the ghosts of places like Chelmno hung heavy in the air, invisible, almost forgotten. Yet in the scattered offices of the new authorities, the survivors' testimonies waited, their pages trembling with the weight of truth. Somewhere in those pages, the names of the guilty were written, and though the ink had faded, history had not. At first, there was chaos. The war's end brought millions of displaced people wandering through the rubble of Europe. The victors, Soviet, American, British, and Polish, were busy dividing territories, redrawing borders, and rebuilding governments. Justice, for a time, was an afterthought. The officers and guards of Chelmno slipped quietly into that confusion. Many discarded their uniforms, burned their papers, and vanished among the refugees. They returned to farms, to factories, to small towns where no one asked questions. They reinvented themselves as bakers, teachers, clerks, and fathers. They were men who had stood over pits of burning bodies, now shaking hands in markets and blessing their children before bed. The silence of peace became their refuge. But history has a strange way of remembering what men try to erase. The first spark of justice for Chelmno came from the survivors themselves, from those who could not forget. In 1945, Polish investigators working with Soviet forces gathered in Lodz to begin documenting Nazi crimes in the region. They had Simon Srebnick's testimony, they had Mordecai Pochlebnik's words, and they had the bones of the forest. Together, they told a story that was impossible to deny. The Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes in Poland prepared reports that described Chelmno in haunting detail: the gas vans, the burning pits, the graves. These documents would become the foundation for the first post-war trials. In 1946, the city of Lodz held a trial of 10 former members of the Chelmno killing unit. They were low-ranking men, guards, drivers, and clerks, not the architects of genocide but its hands and eyes. The courtroom was small, the air heavy with tobacco smoke and tension. The defendants sat in silence, their faces pale, their uniforms replaced by civilian suits that didn't quite fit. Across from them sat the survivors, thin, hollow-eyed, carrying memories that words could barely hold. When the proceedings began, the translators struggled to keep pace with the torrent of detail that spilled from the witnesses' mouths. The truth came not as accusation, but as testimony, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Simon Srebnick did not attend. He was still a boy, living under the protection of the Polish state. But his words were read aloud, his name echoing through the chamber. Mordecai Pochlebnik stood in person, his hands shaking as he spoke. He described the manor, the gas vans, the forest. He looked directly at the men who had once given the orders. One of them avoided his gaze, another smirked faintly, a third wept. The judge listened without expression. The stenographer typed steadily, each keystroke marking the conversion of horror into evidence. When the sentences came, the courtroom was silent. 9 were sentenced to death. 1 received life imprisonment. The execution took place weeks later in a prison courtyard, a thin layer of snow covering the ground. Witnesses said the men went quietly, their faces blank, their bodies trembling as the nooses were placed. There were no last words recorded. For the survivors, it was not satisfaction. Justice could not bring back the dead. It could only remind the living that silence had consequences. But the real architects of Chelmno, those who designed, ordered, and refined its killing process, were still free. Herbert Lang, the camp's first commandant, had died in 1945 during a skirmish with Polish partisans. His death denied the world the chance to question him, to force from his mouth the details of how he had turned a manor into a machine. Hans Bothmann, who took over after Lang, escaped capture for years. He was rumored to have fled west, living under a false identity in Germany. Others said he had taken his own life before the Allies could find him. For years, no one knew. His name became a ghost in the archives, a reminder that evil often vanishes behind paperwork and false names. The post-war years passed, and Europe tried to move on. The Cold War began, dividing East from West, and the urgency of the Holocaust crimes seemed to fade beneath the politics of survival. In Germany, new governments were formed, new economies grew, and the shadows of the past began to blur. Many of those who had served in the killing units of the East quietly reintegrated into society. They worked as policemen, teachers, and civil servants. For a time, it seemed as though the forest of Chelmno would be left behind, a wound covered over by history's distractions. But in the 1960s, a new generation of prosecutors in West Germany began to reopen old files. Among them was a young man named Fritz Bauer, who believed that the crimes of the Holocaust were not only a matter of history, but of moral obligation. He insisted that the German courts, not foreign tribunals, confront what their own citizens had done. Under his influence, the investigation into Chelmno resumed. Former SS officers were tracked down across Germany. Old photographs, letters, and records were compared. Names once buried in bureaucratic lists resurfaced. The forest had begun to whisper again. In 1962, in the city of Bonn, a new trial opened, this time against men who had held command at Chelmno. Among the accused were Walter Burmeister, a driver of the gas vans, and several guards who had survived the war. The witnesses were older now, their faces lined with age, but their memories remained sharp. Simon Treblinka, by then living in Israel, returned to testify. When he walked into the courtroom, every camera turned toward him. The journalists called him the boy who sang in Chelmno. He sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the men who had once controlled his life. The prosecutor asked him to describe what he had seen. His answers were simple, direct, and devastating. "I saw people go into the trucks," he said. "I heard the engine start. When the doors opened again, they were gone." The defense tried to discredit him, arguing that he was only a child at the time, that his memories were unreliable. But the court believed him. There was something in his calmness, his refusal to dramatize, that made his words impossible to doubt. When asked how he had survived, he answered softly, "I don't know. Maybe because I was small. Maybe because I could sing." The Chelmno trials of the 1960s did not draw the attention that Nuremberg had. There were no grand speeches, no world leaders in attendance, no cameras broadcasting verdicts across continents. They were smaller, quieter, more intimate, a confrontation between a few old men and the ghosts of the people they had destroyed. Yet in their quietness lay something profound. Each testimony, each photograph, each exhibit was a restoration of history, a resurrection of truth from the ashes of denial. One by one, the accused spoke. Some denied everything. Others claimed they were just following orders. A few admitted guilt, but only in vague, emotionless terms. They said they had been soldiers, not murderers. They said they had no choice. They said they did not know what was inside the trucks. But the evidence was too precise, the witnesses too certain. The court found several guilty, sentencing them to long prison terms. None received the death penalty. West Germany no longer executed criminals. For many survivors, the verdicts fell hollow. The punishment did not match the crime. Yet even that imperfect justice was a kind of victory. The world had heard the truth spoken aloud, in German, on German soil. In Poland, the forest of Rzeszów was declared a national memorial. Stones were laid, plaques were carved, and the names of towns whose people had perished there were inscribed in cold metal. Schoolchildren were brought to visit, walking through the same paths where the victims had marched. Guides told the story of Chelmno, not as distant history, but as a warning, that evil can hide in simplicity, that genocide begins with language, not bullets. For every student who stood among those trees, the silence became an education. Decades later, as the last of the perpetrators died and the last of the witnesses aged, the trials faded into the background of collective memory. Yet the transcripts remained, thousands of pages of words typed in sterile font, recording voices that trembled and broke and sometimes fell silent mid-sentence. Historians would later call them one of humanity's most haunting archives, the record of a place that had almost disappeared, rescued by the persistence of those who refused to let it vanish completely. By the 21st century, Chelmno's story was no longer just about guilt and punishment. It had become a mirror, reflecting not only the crimes of the past, but the choices of the present. The trials, for all their limitations, have forced the world to see that evil does not end with victory or defeat. It endures in silence, in forgetting, in the comfort of indifference. The men who built Chelmno had counted on time to bury their deeds. The witnesses and judges, imperfect though they were, had refused to let time win. In the end, justice for Chelmno was never complete. Too many names went unpunished, too many crimes unrecorded. But perhaps justice was never meant to be a verdict. Perhaps it was the act of remembering itself, the decision to say the names aloud, to write them down, to face what was once hidden in the forest shadow. In that sense, every trial, every testimony, every page was a continuation of the same struggle, to keep truth alive in a world that would rather look away. As the chapter closes, the camera moves once more through the quiet forest of Rzeszów. The trees stand tall, their branches brushing against a sky that has long since cleared of smoke. The earth below is still uneven, still restless. The wind stirs, carrying with it echoes of words spoken in courtrooms decades ago, words of guilt, denial, and memory. And in that wind, one can almost hear the verdict that history itself has rendered, that the crimes of Chelmno will never be forgotten, and the silence of its killers will never outweigh the voices of those who survived to speak. Chapter 14. Shadows of Memory. The forest was quiet again, but it was not the same silence that once hid screams. It was older now, gentler, softened by time, but heavy with memory. The manor was gone, its stones scattered, its outline marked only by uneven soil and moss. Yet anyone who stepped into that place felt something shift in the air, a stillness that seemed to listen, to remember. The years had passed, decades even, but Chelmno still existed in the wind that passed through the Rzeszów trees, in the earth that refused to forget what had been done there. History was buried beneath layers of time, but memory always found a way to breathe. After the last trials faded from headlines and the survivors grew old, the story of Chelmno risked disappearing once more. The world moved forward, building monuments to larger camps, to grander atrocities, while Chelmno remained small and almost invisible, a whisper compared to the roar of Auschwitz or Treblinka. There were no iconic gates here, no towering chimneys, no endless rows of barracks. Chelmno was the absence of everything, and yet it was the beginning of it all. It was where the idea was tested, that murder could be perfected, industrialized, made efficient. To forget Chelmno was to forget where the horror truly began. In the decades following the war, the land changed hands and purposes. Farmers worked near the forest edge, their plows scraping through layers of ash that the rain could never wash away. Children played on the roads leading to the site, unaware that beneath their feet lay the remains of thousands. The locals spoke less and less about it, and when they did, Their voices dropped to whispers. The words were always the same: the camp, the forest, the place. They rarely said its name aloud. Chelmno had become something like a curse, a word that carried too much pain to utter. But even silence cannot protect the living from memory. In the 1970s, a group of Polish historians, led by Józef Marszalek, returned to the site to conduct a full archaeological and historical investigation. They brought shovels, notebooks, and maps drawn from old testimonies. They began to dig, carefully, layer by layer, through decades of earth and foliage. What they found was not grand or obvious, just fragments. A piece of a shoe, a bone, a bullet casing, melted glass. Yet each piece was a story, a trace of someone who had been erased. The researchers documented everything, photographing each object, marking each pit, mapping every inch of the killing ground. Their work was quiet, methodical, reverent, as if they were listening to the land itself speak through what it revealed. One of the workers later said that some nights, after digging all day, he could still smell smoke even though no fire had burned there in decades. Another described hearing faint cries on the wind when the forest swayed. The human mind, they said, invents such things, but those who have stood in Chelmno know better. The past does not disappear here. It lingers, waiting to be acknowledged. By the late 20th century, the Polish government established a small museum near the site, not to display horror, but to preserve remembrance. Visitors arrive from around the world, survivors, families of victims, historians, students. They walk through the paths that once led to death, past simple wooden crosses and stone markers engraved with the names of towns whose people had been brought here: Kolo, Dabi, Turek, and dozens of others, each a chapter in the story of extermination. There are no grand exhibits or digital screens, just silence and earth, and the feeling that the forest was watching. Survivors who returned often said that coming back was like touching a wound that never healed. Simon Treblinka visited again in his final years. He walked slowly through the clearing, his face expressionless, his eyes distant. When asked how it felt, he said, "Everything is gone, but it is still here." He pointed to the ground, to the trees, to the air itself. It never left. For him, and for the few who had lived through it, Chelmno was not just a place. It was a shadow that stretched across their lives, a darkness that followed them through every moment of survival. For the new generations born long after the war, Chelmno became a lesson, one that could not be taught in textbooks alone. School trips were organized, and children, wide-eyed and quiet, stood among the memorial stones, reading inscriptions they could barely comprehend. Teachers spoke of history, of war, of genocide, but the forest spoke louder. The rustling of leaves, the soft crack of twigs underfoot, the smell of damp soil, all of it carried the weight of something ancient, something that could never be fully explained. The students would leave with more questions than answers, and maybe that was the point. In the archives of the museum, the curators collected every testimony, every photograph, every scrap of paper connected to Chelmno. They gathered the reports from Soviet investigations, the transcript from post-war trials, the drawings made by survivors to reconstruct the camp's layout. Each item was fragile, yellowed with age, yet together they formed the skeleton of remembrance. It was a museum not of artifacts, but of absences. What defined Chelmno was not what remained, but what was missing. And yet, even with preservation came distortion. Over time, myths crept into the story, exaggerations, misinterpretations, simplifications. Some locals began to tell ghost stories, turning tragedy into folklore. Others dismissed the events altogether, claiming it had all been exaggerated or that it was too long ago to matter. Denial became its own shadow, quieter than hatred but just as dangerous. Historians and educators fought against it, reminding the world that truth fades not when it is destroyed, but when it is ignored. Across Europe, monuments rose to honor victims of the Holocaust. Some were vast and monumental, walls of names, towers of shoes, fields of stone. Chelmno's memorial, by contrast, was modest. A single sculpture stood among the trees, its rough surface catching the light like a wound that refused to close. The simplicity was deliberate. This place had no need for spectacle. Its power lay in its stillness, in the quiet acknowledgement that beneath every footstep rested the ashes of human beings whose names the world had nearly forgotten. On the anniversary of its liberation, ceremonies are still held. Survivors' families come from across the world, carrying flowers and candles. They stand in silence as the air cools and the evening light turns gold. The wind moves gently through the grass, bending it like a bow. Prayers are whispered in Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, German. There are no speeches, only presence, as if being there, breathing there, is itself an act of defiance. Some cry softly, some say nothing at all, and when the sun sets, the candles flicker among the stones like stars fallen to earth. But remembrance is fragile. As the years pass, the number of living witnesses dwindles. The last survivor of Chelmno has long since died. Now, the task of remembering falls to those who never knew the place firsthand: historians, filmmakers, teachers, and visitors. The burden is different for them. They must keep alive something they never saw, must feel empathy for a past they cannot touch. It is not easy. Memory without experience is like light seen through water, refracted, distorted, but still visible. The challenge is to keep that light from dimming completely. In the 21st century, technology has changed how Chelmno is remembered. Digital reconstructions of the camp have been created using survivor sketches and ground scans, allowing people around the world to walk virtually through the site that no longer exists. Museums offer online archives where the testimonies of Treblinka and Treblinka can be heard in their own voices, trembling but resolute. Students in distant countries can now stand, if only through a screen, in the clearing where history's first extermination camp once stood. The forest, once meant to hide death, now transmits memory through light and code. Even so, nothing can replace the stillness of standing there in person, feeling the cold air brush against your skin, hearing nothing but the wind. Each year, as new generations visit, they bring questions the survivors can no longer answer. Why here? Why then? How could ordinary people have done this? The guides answer as best they can, pointing to the history, to the ideology, to the machinery of hate. But there is always a pause at the end, a silence that no explanation can fill. Because Chelmno was not built by monsters. It was built by men. Men with families, with laughter, with love. Men who turned all of that into instruments of death. And that, more than anything, is what makes the place unbearable. Standing there today, one might see nothing remarkable. Just a field, a cluster of trees, the ruins of a cellar, the outline of old roads half buried by moss. But look closer, and the details begin to emerge. The uneven soil that once covered graves. The faint depressions that mark the loading zones. The fragments of brick that once formed the manor's foundation. The stones placed in neat rows by survivors' families, each one representing a life extinguished without a grave. It is a place that demands not awe, but humility. For the people who live nearby, Chelmno has become part of the landscape, a reminder, a burden, and a responsibility. Some tend the memorial grounds voluntarily, cleaning paths, trimming grass, placing flowers. They do it quietly, without recognition, understanding that remembrance is not about fame, but about duty. Others still avoid it, saying the forest feels cursed. And perhaps, in its own way, it is. But it is also sacred, consecrated not by faith, but by memory. The scholars who study Chelmno often describe it as the forgotten camp, the ghost at the edge of history. Yet it is precisely that ghostliness that makes it powerful. It is not monumental or visible from afar. It is intimate, human-sized, unassuming. It reminds us that genocide begins in places just like this, quiet, ordinary, hidden behind the everyday. Evil does not announce itself with fanfare. It grows quietly, in the spaces where people stop paying attention. As night falls over the forest, the museum closes, and the visitors depart. The candles burn low, the air turns colder. The wind rustles through the birches, carrying whispers across the clearing. Somewhere in that wind is the memory of engines starting, of voices calling out in confusion, of silence swallowing sound. But also within it is the echo of defiance, of those who survived, who spoke, who refused to let this place vanish from history. Chelmno's story is not just about death. It is about endurance, the endurance of truth, of memory, of the human spirit's refusal to look away. Every stone, every photograph, every name carved into the memorial walls is a thread connecting the living to the dead. And as long as someone walks through that forest and feels the weight of what happened there, the shadows of memory will continue to speak. The chapter closes with the image of dawn breaking over the WW2 forest. Mist clings to the trees, sunlight filters through the branches, and the air glows faintly golden. The world looks peaceful, almost too peaceful. But beneath that beauty lies the truth of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and remembrance. The forest does not forget. It watches, it breathes, it endures. And in its quiet, eternal way, it tells the story of Chelmno, the place where silence once served evil and now serves as a monument to never forgetting. Chapter 15. Never Again. The morning light rises over the forest of WW2 like a soft confession. The mist lingers low, clinging to the ground as if reluctant to let go. Dew collects on the grass that grows over the ashes of thousands, and somewhere in the distance, a bird calls out, fragile, hesitant, alive. The world has changed beyond recognition since the days when smoke filled this sky, but Chelmno still breathes quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the living to listen. Every year, a few more come, survivors' grandchildren, historians, travelers who heard of the place in whispers, and they stand here in silence. They look at the trees, the soil, the memorial stones, and realize that what they are standing on is not just history. It is warning. It is proof. It is the fragile boundary between remembrance and repetition. 80 years have passed since the engines fell silent, yet the echoes remain. Chelmno was supposed to disappear, to dissolve into anonymity. It was not designed to be remembered. It was designed to leave nothing. But memory, like truth, resists destruction. The wind still carries it, the soil still releases it, and the names that once vanished without trace now live in books, archives, and stories. The name, Chelmno, once whispered in fear, has become a symbol, not of death alone, but of the world's duty to remember. The phrase, never again, is written on countless memorials, spoken in classrooms, printed in textbooks. But here, at Chelmno, it carries a different weight. It is not rhetoric or politics. It is a whisper between the living and the dead. Never again was born from places like this, not from the ruins of great cities or the speeches of statesmen, but from the ashes of nameless people who died believing the world would never know their names. And though the world did learn their story, the question lingers still. Has it learned the lesson? The 20th century did not end genocide. From Cambodia to Rwanda, from Bosnia to Darfur, the same pattern repeated: dehumanization, silence, bureaucracy, killing. Each time, the world said, never again, and each time, it looked away when the pattern began anew. Chelmno is no longer only a Polish tragedy or a Jewish tragedy. It has become a human one, a mirror held up to every generation that follows. Its silence asks us not only what happened, but what we will do when it begins to happen again. When visitors come, many ask what they are supposed to feel. The guides do not tell them. There are no right emotions here, only honesty. Some weep. Others feel nothing at all, just numbness, disbelief. A few leave halfway through, unable to walk the paths where the victims once marched. And that, too, is part of remembrance. To be overwhelmed, to be broken, to face the unbearable truth that civilization itself once built this place and called it necessary. The point of visiting Chelmno is not to find closure. There is no closure. It is to remember that humanity's worst acts were not committed by madmen, but by ordinary people who stopped seeing others as human. In recent decades, historians have unearthed new layers of understanding. With each discovery, the image of Chelmno becomes clearer, more horrifying in its simplicity. Unlike Auschwitz, it had no vast infrastructure. Unlike Treblinka, it left no clear ruins. It was a small experiment that became the model for industrial genocide. Here, the Nazis perfected the use of gas vans, mobile chambers disguised as delivery trucks, and refined the logistics of killing. Victims arrived, were deceived, stripped, and murdered within hours. Their bodies were burned, their names erased. Chelmno was not a camp. It was a process. It was death reduced to a routine. That efficiency is what makes it most terrifying. Evil did not roar here. It whispered. It operated through clipboards, rosters, and fuel schedules. The men who ran the camp did not think themselves monsters. They thought themselves workers, efficient, obedient, pragmatic. That is the lesson that Chelmno leaves behind, perhaps the hardest one to face. That atrocity does not require hatred alone. It requires apathy, obedience, and silence. It thrives when good people say nothing, when compassion becomes inconvenient, when bureaucracy replaces conscience. In the decades after the war, as the survivors' voices grew quieter, a new generation began to take their place as guardians of memory. Teachers, writers, and filmmakers dedicated their lives to preserving what the victims could no longer tell. The museum at Chelmno grew, not in size but in meaning. Its rooms filled with artifacts, children's shoes, broken glasses, torn photographs, a wedding ring fused by fire. Visitors walked slowly through the exhibits, their steps echoing on the floorboards. There is no music, no narration, just the sound of breathing and the soft hum of memory. Each object is a fragment of a person, a reminder that history is not numbers, but lives. At the far end of the museum stands a single display case holding a small metal tag. It once belonged to a man from Lodz, deported in 1942. His name is known only because it was etched into that piece of tin. Everything else, his family, his face, his voice, was lost. Yet through that small object, he exists again, defying the very system that tried to erase him. That is the power of remembrance. It restores individuality to those who were reduced to nothing. It gives names back to numbers. Every year, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, candles are lit across Poland. At Chelmno, the ceremony begins before dawn. The air is cold, the sky pale. Survivors' descendants gather beside the memorial stone, holding photographs of those who were lost. The rabbi begins to pray, his voice trembling through the stillness. There are no cameras, no speeches, only the sound of wind moving through the forest. When the prayer ends, silence follows, the same kind of silence that once hid the cries of the dying, now transformed into reverence. In that silence, time feels suspended. Past and present blend into one. The power of Chelmno lies not in its ruins, but in its invisibility. To walk there is to realize how fragile history truly is. If no one told you, you might not know what happened beneath your feet. There are no towering remains, only soft earth and trees. It is a reminder that the worst horrors can happen in ordinary places, in quiet villages, in forests that look peaceful, in systems that appear lawful. Genocide does not require spectacle. It requires the world's indifference. That lesson is not confined to the past. It lives in every society that forgets its own capacity for cruelty. When you leave Chelmno, you carry its silence with you. It clings to your clothes, your thoughts, your breath. For days afterward, the images stay. The forest, the memorial stones, the faint outlines of graves hidden beneath grass. You remember how the sunlight fell through the trees, and how the wind made the leaves tremble. And somewhere deep inside, you begin to understand that never again is not a phrase carved in stone. It is a task, a responsibility renewed with every generation. The historians who dedicate their lives to preserving Chelmno often speak of memory as a living thing, something that must be tended like a flame. If left alone, it fades. If ignored, it dies. They warn that the danger of forgetting is not only that the past might repeat itself, but that the present might lose its humanity. When remembrance becomes routine, when history becomes mere education, empathy withers. That is why Chelmno matters, because it forces us to confront not only what happened, but what we are capable of. Across the world, Holocaust education continues to face challenges. Conspiracy theories spread, denial grows louder, and time erodes the immediacy of horror. As the last witnesses pass away, the burden of proof falls on the next generation. Digital archives preserve their voices, documentaries replay their faces, and museums translate their words into dozens of languages. But technology cannot replace conscience. Memory must live in people, in their decisions, in their actions, in the moral courage to speak when silence feels safer. Chelmno stands as a quiet teacher. It teaches that evil can wear a uniform, a smile, a sense of duty. It teaches that innocence can be destroyed by paperwork. It teaches that forgetting is the beginning of complicity. In its stillness lies an accusation and a plea. Do not let this happen again. Do not let the machinery of indifference turn again. Do not wait until the forest is filled with smoke before you notice that it burns. As the years move further away from 1945, the survivors' children grow old, and their grandchildren inherit the memory. They organize events, write books, plant trees at the site. Each tree bears a name, a family erased, a life restored in remembrance. The forest grows thicker, but unlike before, it grows in peace. The roots dig deep into the same soil that once hid the dead, turning horror into life. Perhaps that is the quiet redemption of Chelmno. Not forgiveness, but transformation. From destruction came renewal. From silence, remembrance. There are stories told by locals of how, on certain mornings, the mist over the river looks like smoke, curling through the trees in the same direction it once rose from the fires. Some say it is the forest remembering. Others say it is the souls of the dead returning at dawn. Maybe both are true. Maybe memory is not something we keep, but something that keeps us, a force that ensures the world does not drift too far from conscience. Today, visitors leave notes and flowers near the memorial. Some write prayers, others apologies, some just single words. Remember, forgive. Why? These fragments are collected by the caretakers, read quietly, then stored in a box inside the museum. Every note, every candle, every tear becomes part of the ongoing story. Not an ending, but an echo. For the people who come here, remembrance is not a ritual. It is a confrontation. They stand among the trees and realize that the past is not gone. It is watching. In a world that often feels on the brink of forgetting, Chelmno's silence remains its loudest truth. It reminds us that history's greatest crime began not with fire or hate, but with silence. The silence of neighbors, the silence of bystanders, the silence of nations. Every time we choose silence in the face of injustice, the forest stirs again. Every time we speak, every time we remember, the earth exhales, as if relieved that someone still cares to listen. As dusk falls over the memorial, the shadows stretch long and thin, merging with the trees. The last light of day glows golden against the memorial stones, turning them into small flames scattered across the clearing. The camera moves slowly through the forest, tracing the path the victims once walked. The narrator's voice softens, not as an ending, but as a vow. This is not just a place of death. It is a place of conscience. The world will forget many things, wars, borders, names, but it must never forget this. The wind rises, rustling the leaves, whispering through the birch and pine. It sounds almost like breath. The screen fades to black, and the words appear, simple and unadorned. Never again. The voice returns one last time, quiet and solemn. The forest remembers. The earth remembers. And so must we. Because when memory fades, darkness begins again. Chelmno was the first. Let also be the last.